The jungle came back every night at 3 in the morning. Same time, same sounds, same copper taste of fear coating the back of his throat like he'd been sucking on pennies. James Thornton's eyes snapped open in the darkness of his bedroom, heart hammering against ribs that had grown more prominent with each passing year. Sweat soaked through the threadbare t-shirt he'd worn since his second tour. The fabric clung to skin that had lost its tightness decades ago, hanging loose over a frame that had once carried 200 pounds of muscle and now barely managed 160. He was 67 years old. The nightmare was 52 years old. Neither had aged well. The ceiling fan wheezed overhead, its rhythm irregular, one blade slightly bent from the time he'd thrown his boot at it during another episode. 3:17 a.m. He didn't need to check the clock. His body knew. The same moment every night when Tommy's voice cut through the years like a blade. "Jimmy, don't let me die alone." Thornton sat up, bare feet finding the cold hardwood floor. The house was small. 2 bedrooms he didn't need. A kitchen where he made coffee and not much else. A living room dominated by a television he rarely watched. All of it paid for by a military pension that felt less like retirement and more like blood money. He moved through the darkness without turning on lights. 30 years living here, and he still navigated like he was on patrol, checking corners, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Some habits never died. Some you wouldn't kill, even if you could. The photograph waited on the kitchen table where he'd left it before bed. Always there, always watching. 11 young men in jungle fatigues, rifles slung casual over shoulders, grins that said they believed they were immortal. The date stamped on the border, April 1972. Location, somewhere in the Central Highlands that didn't have a name on any map that mattered. Thornton was the one on the far left. 19 years old with a baby face and eyes that hadn't seen anything yet. Tommy Bridger stood next to him, arm draped over Thornton's shoulder like they were fraternity brothers instead of soldiers. Tommy had been 20, from some small town in Iowa where everyone knew everyone and nobody locked their doors. He'd enlisted because his father had served in Korea and his grandfather in World War II. Legacy, he'd called it. Duty. The other 9 faces stared back with the same naive certainty. Lieutenant Porter, who'd graduated West Point and thought tactics textbooks could predict chaos. Sergeant Martinez, built like a bulldog, who'd survived 2 tours and swore he'd survive a third. Jackson, Williams, O'Reilly, Chen, Davis, Kowalski, and Murphy. Different backgrounds, different reasons for being there. Same outcome. All dead before May. All dead except the coward who'd lived. Thornton's hand moved to the cabinet above the sink, fingers finding the bottle of Jack Daniels without looking. He'd bought it 6 months ago, hadn't opened it, just needed to know it was there. A loaded gun he could point at himself if the ghost got too loud. His hand trembled as he gripped the bottle. The glass was cool, smooth, promising relief that would last exactly as long as unconsciousness and leave him worse in the morning. He'd learned that lesson twice before in the decades since coming home. Learned it hard enough that he'd been sober for 19 years. The bottle went back in the cabinet. Coffee instead. Black, strong enough to strip paint. He measured grounds with the precision of a man who'd learned to find order in small rituals because the big things were too broken to fix. While the machine gurgled and hissed, Thornton walked to the small den off the kitchen. His office, though he had no work that required one. The walls were bare except for a single shadow box containing his medals. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, campaign ribbons from conflicts that had started to blur together in history books, all of it mounted behind glass like evidence in a trial that never ended. He didn't look at them often. Heroes got medals. Survivors got by. The coffee finished brewing just as dawn started bleeding gray through the windows. Thornton carried his mug to the front porch, settling into a wooden rocker that had been old when he'd bought the house. The Tennessee hills rolled away in layers of mist and forest, peaceful in a way that made his chest ache. Tommy had been from Iowa, cornfields and flatland. He'd talked about it constantly those last weeks, talked about the farm his family worked, the girl he'd left behind, the life he'd planned. Thornton wondered sometimes if that girl had married someone else, if she was a grandmother now, if she ever thought about the boy who'd promised to come home. The phone rang inside the house, loud enough to shatter the morning quiet. Thornton didn't move. Phones meant people. People meant questions he didn't want to answer or conversations he didn't want to have. The ringing stopped. Started again. Whoever it was didn't understand that being ignored was the answer. On the fourth round, Thornton hauled himself up and went inside. The caller ID showed a number with a Georgia area code, Fort Benning. He stared at it for 3 more rings before answering. Thornton. Jim, it's been a long time. The voice hit him like incoming fire. 30 years since he'd heard it, but recognition was instant. Price. General Michael Price now, if the Christmas cards that Thornton never answered were accurate. General, didn't expect to hear from you. That's because you don't answer when I try to reach you. Price's voice carried the easy authority of someone who'd climbed ranks by being competent instead of political. How are you, Jim? Still breathing? That's not what I asked. It's the only answer that matters. Silence on the line, the kind that meant Price was choosing his next words carefully. They'd served together back when Price was a captain, and Thornton was trying to remember how to be human. Price had been one of the few who'd understood that some soldiers came home with wounds that never showed up on medical reports. Jim, I need your help. I'm retired. I know, that's why I'm calling. Thornton moved to the window, looking out at the hills that had become his fortress. What kind of help? The kind that requires someone who knows what real training looks like. Fort Benning's got a problem, advanced infantry course. Quit rate is 40%. The ones who don't quit aren't learning what they need to survive. They're soft. That's not my problem. It could be. 3 months, come down, shake things up, show these instructors what right looks like. Then you go back to your hills and your solitude and we never bother you again. No, Jim, please, I'm asking as a friend. We haven't been friends in 30 years, Mike, because you won't let anyone be your friend. But that doesn't change Hugh City. That doesn't change the fact that if I hadn't pulled you out of that building, you'd be on a wall in D.C. instead of standing in your kitchen arguing with me. The memory came sharp and immediate. 1968. Urban combat that made hell look organized. Thornton pinned down in a building that was more rubble than structure. Wounded, out of ammunition, waiting for death. Price had come anyway, dragged him out through streets that chewed up anyone stupid enough to move. Saved his life when any rational person would have written him off. That was 56 years ago. And you still owe me. I'm calling in the debt. Thornton's jaw clenched. That's a cheap move, Mike. Desperate times. These kids need what you have. Experience, real training, the kind that keeps them alive when everything goes wrong. I'm 67. I train bird dogs now, not soldiers. Dogs are easier. They listen. They follow commands. They don't question why. But soldiers aren't dogs, Jim. They're someone's son, someone's daughter. They go out there unprepared. They don't come home. You know that better than anyone. The words found their target like Price knew they would. Thornton closed his eyes, seeing 11 young faces that hadn't come home. Seeing Tommy's face most of all. 3 months, Price said quietly. That's all I'm asking. Come down. Run them through your style of training. Show them what hard looks like. If it doesn't work, you walk away and I never ask again. And if I say no, then I respect that. But I'm hoping you won't, because somewhere in Tennessee, there's still the soldier who earned that silver star. The one who brought his entire company home from an ambush that should have killed them all. That soldier understood that training saves lives. I'm hoping he's still in there somewhere. Thornton opened his eyes. The medals on the wall caught the morning light, glinting like accusations. The silver star had been for the company he'd saved, the one after his original squad had died. He'd learned hard lessons in blood and loss, then spent 3 more years applying them. Became the soldier who anticipated ambushes instead of walking into them, who trained men to survive instead of just fight. But that was tactics, strategy, the mechanics of staying alive. It didn't erase the fundamental truth that in the moment that mattered most, when Tommy and the others had needed him, James Thornton had chosen himself. I'll think about it, he said finally. I need an answer today. Course starts Monday. What day is it? Thursday. 4 days. 4 days to decide if he could face young soldiers again. 4 days to determine if redemption was still possible or just another word for self-delusion. I'll call you back in 2 hours, Thornton said and hung up before Price could respond. He stood in the kitchen, mug of coffee gone cold in his hand, staring at the photograph of 11 dead men. 1 dead coward. Tommy's smile looked like forgiveness. Thornton knew better. The dead didn't forgive. They just waited. The bottle in the cabinet called to him. So did the quiet of the hills. And underneath both, quieter but persistent, was something else. A voice that sounded like Tommy but might have been his own conscience. "You can't save us, Jimmy, but maybe you can save them." Thornton picked up the phone and dialed before he could talk himself out of it. Price answered on his first ring. "That was fast. 3 months, not a day more, and I do this my way." "Understood. I'm not there to make friends or follow the new regulations. I'm there to make them hard enough to survive. That's exactly why I called you." "When do I start?" "Monday, 0700. I'll have quarters arranged." "I'll drive down Sunday." Thornton paused. "Mike, if this doesn't work, if I can't do this anymore, then we find out together. But I've got a feeling you've got more fight left than you think." After he hung up, Thornton walked back to the porch and sat in the rocker, watching the sun climb higher over the hills. The decision was made. He'd committed. And like every commitment he'd made since 1972, it felt less like a choice and more like penance. The drive to Fort Benning took 7 hours. Thornton made it in his truck, a Ford F-150 that was older than some of the soldiers he'd be training. The radio stayed off. The silence was better company than music or talk shows or anything that required him to think about something other than what waited ahead. He arrived at the base Sunday afternoon, showed his retired military ID at the gate, and followed directions to the bachelor officer quarters. The room was small and efficient, single bed, desk, chair, private bathroom, everything a person needed and nothing they wanted. It reminded him of 100 other temporary spaces he'd occupied over a career spent being temporary. Thornton unpacked with the same precision he'd learned in basic training 50 years ago. Uniforms hung in the closet, spaced exactly 2 finger widths apart. Boots lined up beneath them, toes aligned. Toiletries arranged on the bathroom counter in order of use. His service was long over, but the habits remained, carved into muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. That evening, he walked the base. Fort Benning sprawled across acres of Georgia, home to infantry training that had shaped generations of soldiers. The buildings were newer than he remembered, but the energy was the same. Young men and women in uniform, moving with purpose or exhaustion, or that peculiar combination of both that defined military life. He found himself at the training areas where tomorrow's work would begin. Obstacle courses, rifle ranges, mock urban environments built from plywood and paint. All of it designed to simulate war without the actual dying. Good training saved lives. Bad training just delayed the inevitable. Thornton stood at the edge of a rifle range, remembering a different range in a different time, remembering the weight of an M16, the kick against his shoulder, the smell of cordite and copper and fear. War was loud and close and personal in ways that no training could fully capture. But training could narrow the gap, could turn panic into procedure, could be the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. A voice behind him broke the silence. "Colonel Thornton?" He turned to find a young man in uniform. Captain's bars, Asian features. Couldn't be more than 30. The kind of officer who'd probably gone to West Point and believed military doctrine was gospel. "Retired Colonel," Thornton said. "Just Jim now." "Captain Robert Chen, sir. I'm the primary instructor for the Advanced Infantry course. General Price told me you'd be arriving today." They shook hands. Chen's grip was firm but not aggressive. Professional. Thornton studied him the way he studied everyone, cataloging details. Good posture, clean uniform, eyes that moved constantly, assessing, smart, probably competent, definitely someone who thought he had all the answers. "General said you'd be observing this week," Chen continued, "maybe offering some guidance on training methods." "That's one way to put it. Sir, I want to be direct. I appreciate your service and your experience. But training doctrine has evolved significantly since your era. We follow evidence-based practices now. Stress inoculation, psychological resilience, adult learning principles. That's a lot of words for teaching people not to die." Chen's expression tightened slightly. "It's about creating well-rounded soldiers who can adapt to complex modern combat environments." "How's that working out?" "I'm sorry. Your quit rate, 40%, Price said. That means 60% are still here. What percentage of those are actually learning what they need?" "Our metrics show steady improvement in marksmanship, physical fitness, and tactical knowledge." "Metrics don't bleed. Soldiers do." Thornton turned back to the range. "Tomorrow morning, I'd like to observe your training. Not interfere. Just watch." "Of course, sir. We begin at 0700. I'll be there at 0630. Chen hesitated like he wanted to say something else, then thought better of it. Welcome to Fort Benning, Colonel. I look forward to working with you. After he left, Thornton remained at the range, watching shadows lengthen across the firing line. Chen was exactly what he'd expected. Smart, confident, convinced that modern methods had solved problems that were as old as warfare itself. He probably had statistics and studies and PowerPoint presentations that proved his approach worked. But numbers didn't scream. Numbers didn't call your name while bleeding out. Numbers didn't haunt you for 52 years. Tomorrow he'd see what these modern methods produced. And then he'd decide whether 3 months was enough time to undo the damage or if Price had called in a favor for nothing. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. Thornton was at the training area by 0600, coffee in a thermos, wearing the uniform Price had authorized him to wear. No rank insignia, just plain digital camouflage that marked him as military, but nothing more. The soldiers began arriving at 0645. Teenagers, most of them, early 20s at most. They moved in small groups, talking, laughing. The easy camaraderie of people who hadn't been tested yet. Thornton counted 32 in total. Mixed gender, mixed ethnicity, the modern military on display. Chen appeared at 0655, accompanied by another instructor, Master Sergeant by his rank. Older than Chen, early 50s, built like he'd spent serious time in the weight room. Face that looked like it had seen some action. He studied Thornton with the wary assessment of someone who'd learned to judge threats quickly. Colonel Thornton, this is Master Sergeant Frank Delacroix. He assists with the advanced course. Delacroix extended his hand. Sir, heard you were coming. Nothing good, I'm sure. A flicker of something passed through Delacroix's eyes. Might have been humor. Might have been challenge. General Price speaks highly of you. That's good enough for me. Let's see if you still think that in a week. At 0700 precisely, Chen called the formation to attention. The soldiers assembled in 4 ranks, movements crisp, alignment good. Whatever else was happening, they'd learned basic discipline. Good morning. Today we're joined by Colonel James Thornton, retired. He'll be observing our training over the next few months, possibly offering some insights from his extensive combat experience. Colonel Thornton served multiple tours in Southeast Asia and subsequent conflicts. Please show him the respect his service deserves. 32 faces turned to look at Thornton. Young faces, curious faces, a few skeptical faces that said they'd heard this speech before from other old soldiers who'd come through trying to relive glory days. Thornton said nothing. Respect wasn't given in introductions. It was earned in mud and sweat in the moments when everything fell apart. Chen continued the brief, outlining the day's training, marksmanship in the morning, tactical movement in the afternoon, combat first aid in the evening. All of it structured, all of it following a curriculum that someone in an office had decided would produce soldiers. They moved to the rifle range first. Each soldier was assigned a lane, targets at 50, 100, and 200 meters. The weapons were modern M4 carbines, lighter than the M16s Thornton had carried, but functionally similar. Point, aim, squeeze. The fundamentals hadn't changed. Chen walked the line, offering corrections on stance and breathing. His technical knowledge was solid, textbook perfect. But Thornton noticed something else. The soldiers were comfortable, too comfortable. They approached the weapons like tools they'd been trained to use, which they were. But there was no edge, no understanding that these tools existed for the singular purpose of ending human life. One soldier in particular caught his attention. Hispanic kid, maybe 22, private first-class rank. Ortega on his name tape. He moved through the firing sequence with mechanical precision, but his eyes were elsewhere. Watching the other soldiers, judging them, competing with them, angry about something that had nothing to do with the target's downrange. After the shooting, Chen gathered them for a debrief. Good work this morning. Specialist Martinez, your grouping at 200 meters was excellent. Private Foster, we need to work on your trigger control. Everyone else, solid performance. Solid performance. Thornton had kept score differently. He'd watched 32 soldiers fire 300 rounds. He'd counted 17 who'd flinched before the trigger broke, 23 who'd lost their sight picture during recoil, and one, Ortega, who'd been fast and accurate but shot like he was imagining faces on the targets. During the lunch break, Thornton approached Chen. Can we talk? Of course, sir. They walked away from the group, far enough for privacy. Thornton chose his words carefully. Your technical instruction is good, but they're not learning what they need. Chen's posture stiffened slightly. Sir, I respectfully disagree. Our qualification rates exceed Army standards. Standards measure competency, not survival. What's the difference? Competency is hitting the target. Survival is hitting the target when you're scared, exhausted, and watching your friends die. When the target is shooting back. When everything you planned is wrong and instinct is all you have left. We incorporate stress training, Colonel, live fire exercises, time pressure, simulated combat conditions. Simulated. Thornton let the word hang. You can't simulate the moment when everything in your body screams to run and you have to stand anyway. You can't simulate watching someone die. You can simulate the noise and the chaos, but not the fear. So what do you suggest? Make them afraid, not of you, not of punishment. Make them afraid of their own limitations. Then teach them to function anyway. Chen's expression hardened. Sir, with respect, that kind of training violates current doctrine on psychological safety and developmental readiness. How many of your students have died in combat? The question landed like a slap. Chen's jaw clenched. None under my direct instruction. Give it time. Thornton walked away before Chen could respond. He knew he'd made an enemy, knew that Chen would resist every suggestion, defend every method, fight to prove that the modern army had evolved beyond whatever dinosaur thinking this old colonel represented. That was fine. Thornton wasn't here to make friends. He was here because 11 ghosts wouldn't let him sleep, and maybe possibly he could keep some new ghosts from being created. That afternoon's training was tactical movement through a mock village, buildings made of plywood, role players acting as civilians and hidden threats. The soldiers moved in squad formations, weapons at the ready, clearing rooms, and calling out contacts. Thornton watched from an observation platform with Chen and Delacroix. The movements were technically sound, good spacing, proper cover, communication that followed procedure. But it was all too clean, too rehearsed, like watching a dance where everyone knew the steps. They move well, Delacroix commented. They move safe, Thornton corrected. There's a difference. Safe keeps them alive. Safe makes them predictable. Predictable gets them killed. The exercise continued. One squad entered a building, cleared the first floor, moved to the stairs. The point man called out clear. The second man moved up. Standard procedure, textbook execution. Then Ortega, acting as third man in the stack, broke formation. Instead of following doctrine, he peeled off, moved to a window, looked outside like he was checking something that wasn't there. Ortega, maintain position, Chen called over the radio. The kid rejoined his squad, but the damage was done. The whole movement had stalled while he'd played cowboy. After the exercise, Chen pulled Ortega aside. Thornton couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language was clear. Chen was correcting. Ortega was nodding, but his expression said he wasn't listening. Wasn't buying whatever lesson Chen was selling. That evening, Thornton found himself back at the empty rifle range, standing in the same spot as the night before. The ghosts were louder here. Tommy, Porter, Martinez, all of them asking the same question they'd been asking for 52 years. Why them and not you? He didn't have an answer. Never had. The tactical explanation was simple. He'd been separated from the squad during the initial ambush. By the time he'd oriented himself, they were already captured. He could have tried to rescue them, could have mounted a one-man assault that would have ended exactly how anyone would predict. Instead, he'd hidden, covered himself in mud and vegetation, played dead while the enemy moved through the area, listened to them find his squad, listened to his lieutenant try to negotiate, listened to Tommy calling his name. For 6 hours, he'd lain in the mud, not moving, barely breathing, convincing himself that survival was the smart choice, that dead soldiers couldn't rescue anyone, that staying hidden was tactical wisdom and not raw cowardice. The VC had left at dawn. Thornton had waited another hour to be sure, then moved, found his squad's bodies, 11 men executed. Tommy had been last, based on the evidence, probably made to watch the others die first. The way his body was positioned, he'd been facing the direction where Thornton had hidden, looking for him, hoping he'd come. Thornton had carried Tommy's dog tags out, had carried all their dog tags, had walked 16 kilometers to friendly lines, reported the ambush, gave coordinates for recovery, had been debriefed, cleared of wrongdoing, told by his new commanding officer that he'd made the right call, that throwing his life away wouldn't have changed the outcome. Officially, Private James Thornton had done everything correctly, survived against odds, valuable intelligence gathered, commended for composure under extreme circumstances. Unofficially, privately, in the space between sleep and waking, James Thornton knew he was a coward who'd let his friends die alone. The night air was cold. Thornton's breath misted in front of him. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear soldiers in the barracks. Laughter, music, the sounds of people who still believed they were immortal. Couldn't sleep? He turned to find Delacroix approaching, 2 cups of coffee in hand. The master sergeant offered one without asking. Thornton took it. Old habit, Thornton said. Combat? Something like that. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Delacroix had the easy quiet of someone who'd spent enough time in the field to know when silence was better than conversation. You were hard on Captain Chen today, Delacroix said finally. I told him the truth. Truth is not always welcome, especially when it challenges everything as someone believes. He believes his methods work. They do work. By the metrics we're given, soldiers graduate, pass qualifications, deploy. And then, Delacroix took a long drink of coffee. Some come home, some don't, same as it's always been. Does that sit right with you? Does it sit right with you? Is that why you're here? Because you think you can change the odds? Thornton didn't answer immediately. The question cut closer than Delacroix probably intended. Or maybe it was exactly as close as he'd meant it to be. Master sergeants didn't get to that rank by being stupid. I'm here because Price called in a favor. That's all. Right. And I'm here because I love Army coffee. Delacroix smiled slightly. Colonel, I've been around long enough to recognize a man with ghosts. Whatever you're carrying, whatever you think you need to prove or fix or make right, just remember something. These kids didn't create your ghosts. Don't punish them for mistakes they didn't make. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm trying to keep them alive. By making them afraid, by breaking down their confidence. That might have worked in your war, but this generation, they need different handling. This generation needs to understand that war doesn't care how they need to be handled. Delacroix finished his coffee and crushed the paper cup. Fair enough. But here's something to think about. You know what kills more soldiers than enemy fire? Suicide. PTSD. The damage done by people who train them to survive combat but not to live after it. You want to make them hard? Fine, but don't forget to leave them human. He walked away before Thornton could respond, leaving him alone with the ghosts and the cold and the uncomfortable feeling that maybe, possibly, Delacroix had a point. The rest of the week followed the same pattern. Thornton observed, Chen instructed, the soldiers performed adequately, and the gap between what they were learning and what they'd need grew clearer in Thornton's mind with each passing day. Friday afternoon, Price called him to his office. The general looked older than his voice had suggested on the phone. 65, but carrying it like 70. Too many years, too many decisions. The weight of command aged you faster than time. How's it going, Jim? Chen's a good instructor. Technical proficiency is high. Soldiers are motivated and disciplined. I hear a but coming, but they're not ready, not for what's actually out there. Price leaned back in his chair. What do you need? Permission to run them my way. One exercise. 72 hours in the field. No safety nets, no scheduled breaks. Make it real enough that they understand what they're actually training for. Jim, we have protocols, safety regulations, training standards that exist for good reasons. I know, and I'll follow them, but within those constraints, I need them to feel what it's like when everything goes wrong, when they're exhausted and scared, and the person next to them is depending on them to keep it together. Price studied him for a long moment. You're asking me to trust you with 32 soldiers based on what? The fact that you haven't spoken to me in 30 years but suddenly show up when I call? I'm asking you to trust that I know the difference between training that looks good and training that saves lives. And if something goes wrong, if someone gets hurt, then it's on me. You can hang it around my neck and send me back to Tennessee. But Mike, these kids are going to deploy. They're going to face people who want to kill them. Would you rather they learn their limitations here, where we can control it, or out there where the cost is measured in body bags? The silence stretched. Price's fingers drummed on his desk, a nervous habit Thornton remembered from 3 decades ago. Finally, he nodded. One exercise. You clear everything with safety. You brief Chen. And Jim, if this goes wrong, I won't just send you back to Tennessee. I'll make sure you never set foot on a military installation again. Clear? Clear. Walking back to his quarters, Thornton felt the weight of the commitment. 32 soldiers, 72 hours. One chance to show them what they were actually preparing for. One chance to maybe, possibly save some lives before they were in a position to be lost. That night, he sat at the small desk in his BOQ and planned the exercise. Not tactics, not training objectives, but scenarios, situations that would push them beyond comfort, force them to make decisions without clear answers, show them that survival wasn't about following doctrine, but about adapting when doctrine failed. He thought about Tommy, about the 11 men who died because their training had been inadequate for the reality they'd faced, about the coward who'd survived by hiding. This time, he'd make sure they knew how to face the chaos, how to function when afraid, how to be the person their squad needed instead of the person their fear wanted them to be. The plan came together slowly. 3 days. Increasing pressure, decreasing resources, simulated casualties, psychological warfare. Everything that could go wrong in combat, compressed into a controlled environment where the only thing that could actually die was their illusion of preparedness. It was cruel. It was necessary. And if it worked, maybe 11 ghosts would finally let him sleep through the night. Saturday morning, he called Chen and Delacroix to a meeting, laid out the exercise, watched Chen's expression shift from interest to concern to outright opposition. Colonel, this violates at least 6 different training protocols. Sleep deprivation alone is strictly regulated. Combat isn't regulated. We have these rules to prevent harm. You have these rules to prevent lawsuits. There's a difference. Sir, I cannot and will not support this exercise as designed. It's unnecessarily harsh, potentially traumatic, and goes against everything we know about effective adult learning. Thornton turned to Delacroix. Master Sergeant? Delacroix had been quiet during the brief, studying the plan with the careful attention of someone who knew what he was looking at. Now he met Thornton's eyes. It's rough, maybe too rough, but I've seen soldiers freeze in combat because training never pushed them hard enough to know their breaking point. If we dial back some of the sleep deprivation, add some safety protocols around the psychological stress, I think we can make it work. You're actually considering this? Chen asked. I'm considering that Colonel Thornton survived wars that killed better men than me. Maybe his methods are outdated, or maybe we've gotten soft enough that outdated is starting to look like wisdom. The argument continued for another hour. Eventually, they reached a compromise. Thornton's core plan would remain. The intensity would be adjusted slightly to meet minimum safety requirements. Chen would observe and maintain veto power if things got genuinely dangerous. And Delacroix would serve as senior enlisted, providing ground-level assessment throughout. It wasn't what Thornton wanted, but it was what he'd get, and maybe it would be enough. Sunday, he briefed the soldiers. All 32 of them assembled in a classroom, looking at him with curiosity and varying degrees of skepticism. He stood at the front, no notes, no PowerPoint, just an old soldier trying to pass on lessons bought in blood. Starting Monday, you'll participate in a 72-hour field exercise. It will be harder than anything you've done so far. You'll be cold, tired, hungry. Things will go wrong. People will depend on you. And you'll have to decide what kind of soldier you want to be. He paused, looking at each face, lingering on Ortega, whose expression was more interested than the others. Some of you think you know what combat is like. You've seen movies, played video games, heard stories. But you don't know, can't know until you're there. This exercise won't teach you what combat is, but it'll teach you what you are, and that's more important. Specialist Amy Torres, a slight woman with a medical badge, raised her hand. Sir, when you were in combat, were you ever scared? The room went quiet. It was the kind of question that had right answers and true answers, and they weren't the same thing. Every single day, Thornton said, fear's not weakness, it's wisdom. Your body telling you the situation is dangerous. Ignoring fear is stupidity, but letting fear control you is what gets people killed. The trick is learning to function while afraid, to do what needs doing even when everything in you wants to run. How do you learn that? By practicing, by pushing yourself further than comfortable, finding your limits, then pushing past them. That's what the next 3 days are for. Another hand, Private Jackson, young black kid with intelligent eyes. Sir, what if we fail? What if we're not good enough? Then you find out here where failure means a poor evaluation instead of a body bag. Better to discover your weaknesses in Georgia than in combat. No one else had questions. They filed out quietly, the weight of what was coming settling over them. Thornton watched them go, seeing echoes of other soldiers from other times. Young, uncertain, hoping they were ready for whatever came next. He'd been exactly like them once, before the jungle, before the ambush, before 6 hours hiding in mud while better men died. The ghost stirred, restless. Tommy's voice echoed across decades. "Jimmy, don't let me die alone." "I won't," Thornton whispered to the empty room. "Not this time." Monday morning would come soon enough. The exercise would begin, and 32 soldiers would learn whether they had what it took to survive when everything went wrong. Thornton returned to his quarters as the sun set. He took out the photograph. 11 dead men, one survivor. He studied their faces, memorizing them again like he did every night. The ritual of remembrance, the penance that never ended. "I'm trying," he told them. "I'm trying to save them this time." The photograph didn't answer. It never did. But somewhere in the gathering darkness, Thornton thought he felt something shift. A lightening of weight, a whisper of possibility. Maybe redemption wasn't about changing the past. Maybe it was about making sure the past didn't repeat. About taking the lessons learned in blood and teaching them in sweat instead. 3 months. That's what he'd promised Price. 3 months to see if an old soldier could teach young ones how to survive. 3 months to see if carrying ghosts for 52 years had taught him anything worth passing on. 3 months to find out if James Thornton was still a coward, or if somewhere, buried under decades of guilt, there was still a soldier worth being. The night deepened. The base grew quiet, and in a small room in the bachelor officer quarters, a 67-year-old man prepared for a battle that had been 52 years in the making. The battle to save a squad he'd failed to save before. The battle to prove that survival and cowardice weren't the same thing. The battle to finally let the ghosts rest. Monday would bring the beginning, but tonight was for preparation, for checking gear, for making peace with whatever outcome awaited, for accepting that some missions couldn't be won, only survived. And maybe, just maybe, that survival would be enough. The helicopter blades chopped the morning air into fragments of sound that triggered memories Thornton had spent 50 years trying to bury. He stood at the edge of the landing zone, watching the Black Hawk settle onto the grass with a grace that machines that size had no right to possess. The downwash flattened everything within 20 meters, turning the Georgia pines into supplicants bowing before mechanical thunder. 32 soldiers waited in formation behind him. Full combat loads, 70 pounds of gear each, faces that still carried the softness of people who'd never been truly tested. In 72 hours, those faces would be different, harder, or broken. There wasn't much middle ground when you push people past their limits. Captain Chen stood beside him, clipboard in hand, already documenting everything for the after-action review. The young officer had been tense all morning, second-guessing decisions, citing regulations, making sure everyone understood this wasn't his idea, covering his ass for when things went wrong, because things always went wrong. That was the point. The helicopter crew chief gave a thumbs up. Time to load. Thornton turned to face the formation. 32 sets of eyes locked on him with varying degrees of anticipation and dread. Private Ortega in the front row looked eager, almost hungry. Specialist Torres next to him looked like she might throw up. The rest fell somewhere between. Mount up. Once we hit the ground, the clock starts. 72 hours, no contact with base, no resupply, no rescue unless someone's actually dying. You've got your mission briefing. Navigate to the objective. Establish observation post. Report enemy activity. Standard reconnaissance. Should be simple. He paused, letting the silence build. It won't be. They loaded in 2 sticks of 16. Thornton took the first helicopter with Chen and Delacroix. The second would drop half a click away with different coordinates, forcing the squads to link up before reaching the objective. Standard procedure. Except nothing about the next 3 days would be standard. The flight lasted 20 minutes, long enough for soldiers to get quiet, long enough for anticipation to curdle into nervousness, short enough that no one had time to truly prepare. Thornton watched the landscape slide beneath them, dense forest broken by occasional clearings. The Chattahoochee National Forest, 400,000 acres of terrain that looked nothing like the jungles of his youth, and everything like the kind of place where war could find you if it wanted to. The crew chief held up 5 fingers. 5 minutes. Chen leaned close, shouting over the engine noise. "Colonel, one more time. The aggressor force knows to keep it realistic but safe. The psychological elements are clearly marked as training aids, and if anyone uses the emergency phrase, we extract immediately." "I heard you the first 6 times, Captain." Sir, I need to be clear. If this crosses the line, if soldiers are genuinely traumatized instead of trained, this stops. Thornton looked at him, really looked, saw a young officer who'd probably never questioned an order in his life, suddenly forced to approve something that violated every instinct his training had installed. Chen wasn't wrong to be concerned. He was wrong to think concern changed necessity. Captain, you know what traumatizes soldiers? Watching their friends die because they weren't prepared. That's trauma. This is just uncomfortable. There's a difference between discomfort and psychological harm. Yeah, about 72 hours. The helicopter flared, nose up, settling hard onto a clearing barely large enough to contain it. The crew chief yanked the door open and soldiers spilled out, moving fast to clear the landing zone. Thornton followed, boots hitting Georgia dirt that felt like every other hostile landing zone he'd ever experienced. The difference was academic to a body that remembered. 16 soldiers in a loose perimeter, weapons pointed outward, spacing good, discipline holding. The helicopter lifted, gaining altitude fast, disappearing into morning haze that turned solid metal into ghost. Silence rushed in to fill the space where engine noise had been. Deep forest silence. The kind where you could hear your own heartbeat and every small sound became threat assessment. Squad leader for this group was Sergeant First Class Martinez, late 20s, 3 years in, Iraq veteran, competent but untested in the specific kind of chaos Thornton had planned. He checked his GPS, oriented the map, looked to Thornton for confirmation. Don't look at me, Sergeant. I'm just observing. Sir, the brief said you'd provide guidance. I'll provide reality. Guidance is your job. Martinez's jaw tightened, but he adapted. Pointed to Ortega. You're on point. Torres, you've got comms. Everyone else, standard patrol formation. We move in 5. The 5 minutes stretched. Soldiers checked gear, redistributed weight, tested radios, all the small rituals that bought time before stepping into uncertainty. Ortega loaded a magazine, press-checked his rifle, moved to the front of the formation with the coiled energy of someone who'd been waiting for this. Thornton watched from the back, Chen beside him. Delacroix ranging slightly forward, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough to let events develop naturally. They moved out at 0742. The second squad would be inserted by now, beginning their own movement. The plan called for link-up at grid reference BP 4471 by 1300 hours. 6 hours to cover 5 kilometers through dense forest with full combat loads. Easy on paper. Different when every step required concentration and every sound triggered assessment. Thornton had walked thousands of clicks like this. Knew the rhythm, the way your mind divided attention between immediate terrain and broader awareness. How fatigue accumulated in small increments until suddenly it was overwhelming. How groups developed personality, some soldiers pushing forward while others lagged. How leaders either enforced discipline or let chaos creep in. This group was still tight, still fresh. Give them 12 hours and different patterns would emerge. 2 hours in, Ortega stopped the formation. Hand up, fist closed, everyone froze. Thornton moved forward quietly, staying low. Found Ortega crouched behind a fallen log, staring at something ahead. A tripwire, thin monofilament stretched between trees at ankle height. Obvious once you saw it, nearly invisible if you weren't looking. ID marker? Martinez asked quietly. Or just a noisemaker? Can't tell without checking. Ortega looked back. Orders? Martinez studied the wire, the terrain, the time. Thornton could see him calculating. Checking the wire meant delay, but ignoring it meant potential casualties if this was more than training. Mark it, we go around, Martinez decided. Smart call. Conservative. The kind of decision that kept people alive in real combat. Ortega tied engineer's tape to a tree at the wire's location, then led the squad in a wide detour that added 30 minutes to their timeline. 3 hours in, the radio crackled. Torres pulled it out, adjusted frequency. Nothing but static. She tried again. Same result. Comms are down, she reported. Equipment failure or jamming, Martinez asked. Torres ran through diagnostics, checked connections, swapped batteries. The radio was fine, the signal wasn't. Someone's jamming us. Chen looked at Thornton. That wasn't in the plan. Plans change. Colonel, they need communications. Standard procedure requires constant contact during training exercises. Combat doesn't provide standard procedure. This isn't combat. Not yet. Martinez made the call to continue without comms. The link-up with second squad was still the priority. They'd sort out communications once both elements were together. logical, professional, exactly what the training manual would recommend. 4 hours in, they found the bodies. Not real bodies. Training dummies dressed in ACUs, positioned in a small clearing. 5 of them, throats cut, dog tags scattered, arranged to look like an ambush site that had gone very bad. The blood was paint, but it looked real enough. The effect was calculated to unsettle. It worked. Several soldiers stopped, staring. Torres went pale. Even Martinez took a moment to process what he was seeing. Ortega moved closer, studying the scene with clinical interest that separated him from the others. Assessment? Martinez asked him. They're positioned like they were resting. Sentries got taken out first, then the others. Quick. Professional. Which means we're dealing with an enemy that knows what they're doing. One of the younger soldiers, Private Jackson, spoke up. Sergeant, this is training, right? Those aren't real? Martinez looked to Chen for confirmation. The captain nodded. Training aids, but treat it like real. That's the point of the exercise. They moved through the site carefully, maintaining security, checking for additional threats. Found nothing. But the mood had shifted. The easy confidence of morning had been replaced by something heavier. Awareness that the scenario could escalate beyond comfortable. 5 hours in, they reached the link-up point. The second squad wasn't there. Martinez checked his watch. 13:15. 15 minutes late wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't good. He positioned security, established a perimeter, settled into wait. 20 minutes became 40. 40 became an hour. At 1400, with still no sign of second squad and no working communications, Martinez faced his first real decision. Wait longer and risk falling behind timeline. Move forward and risk separating further from the other element, or abort and fail the mission. Thornton watched the calculation happen behind the young sergeant's eyes, saw him weigh regulations against circumstances, book answer versus ground truth. We move forward, Martinez decided. Maintain slower pace. Give them a chance to catch up. Torres, keep trying the radio every 15 minutes. They pushed deeper into the forest. The terrain grew rougher. Old growth trees with trunks like cathedral pillars. Underbrush thick enough to hide anything. The temperature dropped as afternoon shadows lengthened. Soldiers' movements lost their crispness, edges blurred by fatigue. 6 hours in, they heard gunfire. Not close. Maybe a click away. Single shots followed by automatic bursts. Then silence. Everyone froze. Weapons coming up to shoulders. Eyes scanning tree lines for targets that weren't there. Second squad? Someone asked. Or the aggressor force demonstrating capability, Chen said quietly. Martinez tried the radio again. Still nothing but static. He looked at Thornton. Sir, with respect, we need guidance. If second squad is engaged, standard procedure is to move to support or call for a quick reaction force. You don't have comms for QRF, and you don't know if that's second squad or aggressor demonstration. What does your gut say? My gut says we're in over our heads. Then you're learning. What are you going to do about it? The silence stretched. 16 soldiers waiting for their leader to lead. Martinez breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the weight of command pressing down for the first time without safety net. We continue to objective, establish overwatch. If second squad doesn't arrive by nightfall, we reassess. They moved, but the cohesion was fracturing. Soldiers kept looking over shoulders, jumping at sounds. The forest that had been neutral terrain was becoming hostile in their minds, exactly as intended. 7 hours in, Ortega found the note. It was pinned to a tree with a knife, written in block letters on standard issue notebook paper. The message was simple and devastating. Sergeant Martinez, your second squad has been captured. They are being held at grid 4482. You have until midnight to reach them. For every hour you're late, one will be executed. Choose wisely. 16 faces turned to Martinez. The sergeant stared at the note like it was written in a language he didn't speak. His hand trembled slightly as he took it down, read it again, processed the implications. Chen stepped forward. Sergeant, this is obviously a training scenario. Second squad is fine. They're probably at the objective waiting for you. With respect, sir, what if they're not? They are. This is psychological pressure designed to test decision-making under stress. But what if you're wrong? The question hung in the air. Chen had no answer because there was no good answer. Training scenarios were supposed to be clearly marked as artificial. But war blurred those lines, and this exercise was designed to blur them further. Thornton spoke for the first time in hours. Sergeant Martinez, what does the mission require? Reach the objective. Establish observation post. Report enemy activity. And what does this note require? Rescue second squad before midnight. Can you do both? Martinez studied his map. The objective was 4 clicks northeast. The grid reference in the note was 3 clicks due east, different directions. Not if we're going to do either one properly. Then choose. Sir, that's not fair. This is training. We shouldn't have to choose between mission and personnel. Fair is a word people use when they don't like reality. In combat, you choose every day. Mission or people, speed or caution, risk or safety. The choices are never fair. They're just necessary. Martinez looked at his squad, saw Torres watching him with something like faith, saw Ortega watching with calculation, saw Jackson looking scared, saw 16 people depending on him to make a call that had no right answer. We split, he decided. Half squad continues to objective, half squad moves to second squad location. Rendezvous at objective after extraction. Thornton nodded slowly. Bold choice, violates doctrine about maintaining unit integrity, but shows understanding that sometimes doctrine gets people killed. Who leads the extraction element? Martinez pointed to Ortega. You've got points, skills, and aggression. Take 7, move fast, link up with second squad. Extract them if possible. If not possible, report back and we adjust. Ortega's face split in a grin. Finally, something interesting. The split happened quickly. Ortega took 6 others, including Jackson. Martinez kept Torres and the remaining 8. They separated at 14:30, 2 small elements disappearing into forest that suddenly felt much larger and more hostile. Thornton stayed with the Martinez's group. Chen went with Ortega. Delacroix split his attention between both, ranging through the forest like a ghost, visible only when he chose to be. Night fell fast in the forest. One moment there was light. The next, shadows merged into darkness that turned familiar terrain into maze. Martinez's reduced squad reached the objective at 1800, well behind schedule, exhausted from 7 hours of movement. The objective was a small ridge overlooking a valley. Good observation position. Defensible. Exactly where a reconnaissance team would want to be. They established security, set up an observation post, began documenting enemy activity in the valley below. Except there was no enemy activity, just an empty valley with a few buildings that might have been agricultural and might have been something else. No movement, no lights, no indication that anything important was happening. Torres tried the radio again. This time it worked, sort of. A signal came through, weak, distorted. A voice that might have been Ortega or might have been something else. Contact, heavy contact, taking casualties, need support, grid 4482. Then static. Martinez tried to respond. Nothing. The transmission had been one way. A message in a bottle, an SOS from people who might already be dead. What do we do? Torres asked. Martinez stared at the radio, at the empty valley below, at the mission that required them to stay and observe, at the squad that might need them right now. We observe, he said quietly. That's the mission. But Ortega, I made the call to split. Now I have to live with it. The night deepened. Hours crawled past. Soldiers took turns on watch while others tried to sleep in full gear on ground too hard and too cold for real rest. Every sound became potential threat. Every shadow became enemy movement. The valley below remained empty. At 2300, another radio transmission, clearer this time, a voice Thornton recognized as belonging to Master Sergeant Delacroix. All elements, this is training control. Second squad has been secured. Casualties reported. Extraction in progress. Martinez element maintain current position and continue observation. Relief flooded through the group. Second squad was safe. The scenario had been just that, scenario. But the relief was temporary because now the question became what casualties and what had the cost been for splitting the force. Martinez keyed his radio. Request status on Ortega element. Long pause. Ortega element encountered prepared defensive position. Sustained 3 simulated casualties, including Ortega himself. They have been extracted to training control for after-action review. 3 casualties out of 7, nearly 50%. The kind of losses that could break a unit. Sustained because Martinez had split his force and sent them into unknown terrain with insufficient intelligence. The sergeant's face went blank, the look of someone processing failure. Understanding in real time that his decision, made under pressure with incomplete information, had gotten people killed, training casualties, simulated deaths. But the weight felt real. Thornton moved next to him. First time? Sir? First time you've lost people, even in simulation. Yes, sir. How does it feel? Martinez took a long breath. Like I should have known better, should have done differently, Should have is the refrain of every commander who's ever lost a soldier. Doesn't help, doesn't change anything, just makes the nights longer. How do you live with it? You don't. Not really. You carry it. You learn from it. You make sure the next decision is better informed by the previous mistake. But you don't stop feeling it. The moment you stop feeling it is the moment you become someone who shouldn't be leading. They sat in silence, watching an empty valley that represented nothing and everything. Around them, young soldiers tried to sleep while carrying the new knowledge that choices had consequences. That leadership meant living with outcomes you couldn't control. The radio crackled again at 0300, 3 in the morning, the hour when nightmares lived. A voice came through that stopped Thornton's heart. Not Delacroix, not Chen, not anyone he recognized from the training cadre. Male, older, Southern accent worn smooth by decades, speaking English with the careful precision of someone for whom it was a learned language. Colonel James Thornton, I know you're listening. I've known where you were for a very long time. Every soldier in the observation post went silent. Martinez looked at Thornton with confusion and growing alarm. Torres' hand moved to her weapon. The voice continued, unhurried, each word chosen with purpose. Your young soldiers died screaming your name all those years ago. Did you hear them? Or were you too busy hiding in the mud to notice? Thornton's hand moved to his own radio, voice tight. Identify yourself. You know who I am. We met a long time ago. In a place where you left 11 boys to die alone. I taught them the cost of survival. I've lived 20 miles from your precious Fort Benning for nearly 4 decades. Watched, waited, and now, with cancer eating what's left of my life, I finally had the courage to finish what we started. That's impossible. You're dead. Am I, or did I simply learn to live with ghosts better than you? 52 years, James. I've carried my family's deaths for 52 years. My wife, my daughter, my son, all killed because American bombs don't care about intelligence errors. And I've watched you train soldiers to make the same mistakes. But now, facing my own end, I realize something. We're both prisoners of the same war. The question is whether we die prisoners or find release. The transmission cut out. Martinez tried to raise anyone on the net. Training control, Chen, Delacroix, nothing but static. Like the entire exercise had disappeared, leaving them alone with a ghost that couldn't exist. Chen's voice finally broke through 5 minutes later. All elements report status. We have an unauthorized transmission on our training frequency. Do not respond to unidentified voices. This is a compromise of the exercise. Maintain your positions. But Thornton wasn't listening. He was back in the jungle, back in the mud, hearing that voice for the first time as it questioned prisoners, as it decided who lived and who died, as it turned torture into lesson. Nguyen Van Thieu, the interrogator, the teacher of hard truths, the man who'd killed 11 American soldiers over 3 days while making Thornton watch from 20 meters away, unable to move, unable to help, unable to do anything but survive. Thieu should be dead, or old enough that tracking Thornton to Fort Benning would be impossible. But that voice, that specific cadence, the way he said American like it was a diagnosis instead of a nationality, the revelation about living nearby for decades, watching, waiting until his own mortality forced action. It was him, and now everything made terrible sense. The proximity, the patience, the timing triggered by terminal diagnosis. Martinez spoke quietly. Sir, what's happening? Who is that man? A ghost from a war that won't end. Should we abort the exercise? Thornton looked at the young sergeant, saw fear mixing with confusion, saw soldiers watching their observer become participant, saw the training scenario tilting from controlled to something else entirely. No, we continue, but everyone stays sharp. Something's wrong and I need to figure out what. The rest of the night passed without incident, or without obvious incident. But Thornton felt eyes watching from the darkness, felt the forest shift from neutral terrain to actively hostile, felt the weight of 52 years pressing down like earth on a coffin. Dawn came reluctantly, gray light filtering through trees that had held secrets all night. At 0600, new orders came through. All elements consolidate at Base Camp Grid 4490. Immediate movement required. Exercise entering final phase. Martinez gathered his exhausted squad, 9 soldiers who'd been awake for 23 hours, carrying 70 pounds of gear, trying to process experiences that didn't fit comfortable categories. They moved out at 0630, formation ragged but functional. The movement to base camp took 3 hours, slower than it should have been. Soldiers stumbling over terrain that shouldn't have been difficult. Fatigue was a weapon that cut deeper than enemies. They reached the consolidation point at 0930, found second squad already there, looking worse than Martinez's element. Found Ortega with a red tag on his chest marking him as simulated casualty. Found Chen coordinating with Delacroix, both men looking tense in ways that had nothing to do with training. And found a black SUV parked at the edge of the clearing. Government plates, tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that appeared when official things happened. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out, late 40s, civilian clothes but military bearing. He moved like someone who'd spent decades being dangerous and saw no reason to advertise the fact. Thornton recognized him instantly, had served with him briefly in the 90s. Commander Marcus Steele, former SEAL, intelligence community connections. The kind of operator who showed up when situations required specific expertise. Steele walked directly to Thornton, ignoring everyone else. "Colonel, we need to talk." "Commander, didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to be here, but we have a situation." Chen intervened. "Excuse me, who are you and what's your authority to interrupt this training exercise?" Steele produced credentials, Defense Intelligence Agency, clearance levels that made Chen's eyes widen. "Captain, I need to borrow Colonel Thornton. Your exercise is about to become more complicated." They walked away from the group, far enough for privacy, close enough that Thornton could still see his soldiers. Steele spoke quietly, words chosen for efficiency. "Wayne Van Teo, you remember him. Hard to forget the man who killed my entire squad. He's alive, living in Columbus, Georgia, 20 miles from Fort Benning. Has been for nearly 4 decades." The words hit like incoming fire. Thornton's vision narrowed. Breathing became manual instead of automatic. "That's impossible. He'd be 80 years old." 82. Immigrated in 1985 under refugee program. Changed his name to Nathan Thomas. Became a U.S. citizen. Worked as a hospital orderly at the VA for 3 decades. Retired 2 years ago. Been living in the area since 1985. 39 years, Jim. He's been 20 miles away from Fort Benning for 39 years. And no one knew? Why would they? He was vetted same as thousands of other refugees. His real identity was buried under paperwork that no one thought to check, until yesterday. What happened yesterday? He walked into Fort Benning's main gate, asked to speak with you, said he had unfinished business from 1972. Security detained him, ran his information, flags started popping in systems that haven't been active since the war ended. That's when I got called. Thornton processed the information, tried to separate emotion from analysis. Failed. Where is he now? Base security holding. But Jim, here's the problem. He didn't come alone. What do you mean? We're still working out details, but it appears he's been planning this for a while. Somehow he knew you were here, knew about the training exercise, and he's made claims about having people positioned in the training area. Says his cancer diagnosis 6 months ago gave him the courage to finally seek closure. That's why the timing. Why now after living nearby for decades? The voice on the radio last night was him, or someone working with him. We've been trying to lock down the situation, but it's complicated by the fact that we have 32 soldiers scattered across 400,000 acres of forest. Are my soldiers in danger? We don't think so, but we don't know. And until we know, I need you to help me understand what we're dealing with, because you're the only person who's met this man and survived. Thornton looked back at his soldiers, exhausted, confused, depending on him to make sense of a situation that violated every assumption about training exercises being safe. He thought about Tommy, about 11 men who trusted him to keep them safe, about 52 years of carrying their ghosts, about the voice on the radio that had known exactly how to find the deepest wound and press. I need to talk to him. That's why I'm here. Now, Jim, we need to brief the chain of command, coordinate with security, make sure we have protocols in place. Commander, if Teo is here after 52 years, after living nearby for 39 years, after receiving a terminal diagnosis that gave him courage he'd lacked before, protocols aren't going to matter. He wants something. And the only way to find out what is to ask him directly. Steele studied him for a long moment, making calculations that involved security versus intelligence versus human factors that couldn't be quantified. Finally, he nodded. The captain isn't going to like this. The captain doesn't have to like it. He just has to keep those soldiers safe while we sort this out. They walked back to the group. Chen saw their expressions and immediately went on alert. What's happening? Training exercise is suspended pending security review, Steele said. All personnel return to base immediately. No one discusses what happened here until debriefed. On whose authority? Mine, Defense Intelligence Agency. If you need confirmation, call General Price. But you're wasting time we don't have. Chen looked at Thornton. Sir, what's going on? Something from a long time ago coming back. Keep the soldiers safe. That's your only job right now. And yours? Mine is to finish something that should have ended in 1972. The ride back to base happened in silence. Steele drove. Thornton watched Georgia landscape slide past, seeing jungle instead of pine forest, seeing 19-year-old faces instead of modern highways, seeing choices that led to moments that defined everything after. At base security, they parked in a restricted area, walked through corridors that smelled like every military building Thornton had ever entered. Concrete, fluorescent lights, the institutional architecture of controlled violence. Theo was being held in an interview room. Standard setup, table, chairs, observation glass, camera in the corner. Everything designed to extract truth from people who didn't want to give it. Steele paused at the door. You sure about this? No, but sure doesn't matter anymore. If this goes sideways, it went sideways 52 years ago. I'm just catching up. The door opened, and there, sitting calmly at the table, hands folded, was the man who'd haunted Thornton's nights for longer than some soldiers had been alive. Nguyen Van Tu, Nathan Thomas, ghost made flesh. He was old. 82 showed in the lines etched deep around his eyes, in the white hair, in the way his hands trembled slightly. But his eyes were sharp, alert, focused on Thornton with recognition that crossed decades like they were nothing. Hello, James, he said quietly. You've gotten old. So have you. Yes, time is unkind to soldiers, but it's especially unkind to cowards. Tell me, do you still hear them at night, calling your name, asking why you didn't come? Thornton sat across from him. Steele remained standing, hand near his weapon, watching for threats that might not be physical. The old man looked frail enough to break. Thornton knew better. Some people carried danger in their bones. Why are you here? Why now after living 20 miles away for 39 years? Because for 39 years I lacked courage. I knew you were at Fort Benning occasionally. Knew you trained soldiers. Watched from distance like a coward watches from safety. But 6 months ago, doctors told me I have cancer. Stage 4, 6 months to live, maybe less. In facing death, I found courage I'd lacked in life. Courage to face the man who defined my guilt. To see if he'd found peace. Because if he had, perhaps there was hope for me. This isn't about burden. You came here with a plan. You knew about the exercise. You have people in the forest. What do you want? Theo smiled, sad, tired, the expression of someone who'd carried weight too long and was ready to set it down. I want to teach you what I learned, that there are no good choices in war, only choices, and living with them after is its own form of combat. I've lived 20 miles from you for decades, worked at the VA where your soldiers came for healing, saw the cost of war every day, and I wanted you to understand something. He leaned forward, eyes bright with intensity that age hadn't dimmed. Those soldiers in your training exercise, you're teaching them to survive, but are you teaching them to live after? Because I taught my soldiers to kill, and then they came home and killed themselves. I had children once, wife, daughter, son. American bombs killed them in 1972. Intelligence error, your military said later. Wrong coordinates. But they were still dead. Just like your Tommy. Just like my family. War made us enemies. But grief makes us the same. Thornton's hands clenched into fists under the table. Every word was a blade finding old scars. Every sentence reopened wounds that had never properly healed. But underneath the anger was something else. Recognition. The understanding that he was looking at a mirror reflecting different choices that led to the same place. What do you want from me? Thornton asked again. I want you to face what you are. Not the hero they gave medals to. Not the instructor trying to save the next generation. I want you to face the scared 19-year-old who chose himself over his friends. Because until you do, you'll keep trying to fix something that can't be fixed. And I want you to understand that I'm the same, that we're both prisoners of wars that ended decades ago but never released us. And you think showing up here accomplishes something? You think living nearby for 39 years, watching, waiting until cancer forced you to act, somehow gives you the right to teach me? I think we're both trapped by the same war. And maybe after 52 years of carrying it separately, it's time we stop fighting it. The room fell silent. Somewhere outside, soldiers were being debriefed. Equipment was being secured. The machinery of military training was returning to normal operations. But in this room, two old men sat across from each other carrying ghosts that refused to rest. Steele's phone buzzes. He stepped outside to take the call. Returned 30 seconds later with an expression that meant complications had just gotten worse. We have a problem. Base security found a letter in the mailroom, addressed to you, Colonel, from someone claiming to be Tio's son. I don't have a son, Theo said calmly. I had a family once, wife, daughter, son, all killed by American bombs in 1972 when your military assumed our village was enemy territory. That's what I did to your soldiers, what you did to my family. The words landed like artillery. Thornton felt the impact in his chest. The math of war was simple and terrible. You killed them, they killed you. Everyone lost. No one won. The only question was, who carried which ghosts? If you don't have a son, Steele said slowly, then who sent the letter? Theo looked genuinely confused. I don't know. I came here alone. This was between James and me, no one else. The letter claims there are people in the training area, that they're positioned to teach your soldiers the same lessons you taught Thornton's squad. It's signed by someone who calls himself Ghost One. Understanding dawned on Theo's face, horror mixing with regret. No, I told him not to. I told him this was my closure, not his. Told who? Frank. Master Sergeant Frank Delacroix. I adopted him when he was 6. After his birth parents died, raised him as my own. Gave him my name, my values, my stories, including stories about the war, about what I did, about the man who survived while his friends died. I told him to let it go, but he never could. He joined the military to understand, to balance my sins with his service. And now I think he's trying to finish what I started. The room went cold. Thornton's mind raced through implications. Delacroix had been in the forest with the soldiers, had access to the training plans, knew every element's position, had the skills and knowledge to turn training into something else entirely, and had spent 30 years hearing stories about James Thornton from a father who'd never forgiven or forgotten. Steele was already on his radio. All units, this is tactical control. We have a potential hostile in the training area. Master Sergeant Frank Delacroix is to be located and detained immediately. All students return to base under armed escort. Move now. He turned to Thornton. We need to get teams into that forest. No, you send teams? He'll see them coming. He's trained for this. Then what do you suggest? Thornton stood, feeling every one of his 67 years and simultaneously feeling 19 again. Feeling the weight of choices that led to this moment. Feeling the pressure of ghosts demanding payment for debts 52 years overdue. I go, alone. Finish what started in 1972. Jim, that's insane. You're not equipped for this. I'm exactly equipped for this. Because Delacroix doesn't want to hurt those soldiers. He wants to hurt me, and the only way to end this is to give him the chance. Theo spoke from the table, voice quiet but carrying weight. James, if you go into that forest, my son will do to you what I did to your squad. He'll make you choose. And this time you won't have the option to hide. I know. Then why go? Thornton looked at the old man who'd defined so much of his life. Because 52 years ago, I made a choice that let 11 men die. I can't change that. But I can make sure it doesn't happen again. Even if the cost is finally facing what I should have faced back then. He turned to Steele. Get those soldiers out safe. That's all that matters. And you? I'm going to have a conversation with Master Sergeant Delacroix about the difference between revenge and justice, and about the price of carrying your father's hate. Thornton walked to the door, paused, looked back at Theo one final time. Those 11 men, did they suffer? The old man's face showed pain that transcended language. Yes, but at the end, I gave them water. Let them talk. Tried to make it easier for whatever that's worth. For it's worth knowing they weren't alone, thank you. Then Thornton walked out into Georgia sunlight that felt nothing like jungle and everything like the approach to combat. His heart hammered, his hands shook, but his steps were steady. Because after 52 years, James Thornton was finally going to face the choice he'd run from. And this time, there would be no hiding in the mud. This time, he'd stand. The forest swallowed Thornton whole within 20 meters of the tree line. One moment, he could see the base perimeter, vehicles moving, soldiers assembling. The next, Georgia pines closed ranks like they were taking sides in a war that had started before they had been planted. He moved with muscle memory older than most of the trees. Low crouch, eyes scanning sectors, weapon ready but not raised. The M4 carbine felt lighter than the M16s he'd carried in his 20s, but the weight was the same where it counted, in the knowledge that this tool existed for one purpose, that using it meant crossing lines you couldn't uncross. Steele had tried to give him a radio. Thornton had refused. Communication meant coordination. Coordination meant tactics. This wasn't about tactics. This was about one old man walking into the woods to face another old man's son carrying a 52 years of inherited hate. The GPS unit in his pocket marked Delacroix's last known position, 6 kilometers northeast, where 2nd Squad had supposedly been captured during the exercise, where the master sergeant had been alone with frightened soldiers and the opportunity to turn training into something else entirely. Thornton moved at a pace that split the difference between speed and caution. Fast enough to matter, slow enough to stay alive. The afternoon sun filtered through canopy and shafts that looked like spotlights marking execution sites. Birds called warnings to each other about the predator moving through their territory. Smart birds. They knew danger when it walked past. An hour in, he found the first marker. Engineer tape tied to a branch. Fresh, positioned exactly at eye level where someone would see it if they were looking. Thornton studied it without touching. The tape was standard issue, could have come from anyone. But the knot was distinctive. Ranger knot, specific school, specific training, Delacroix's signature. The message was clear. I know you're coming. I'm waiting. Follow if you dare. Thornton followed. The terrain grew rougher. Old-growth forests gave way to areas where storms had taken down trees decades ago, leaving deadfall obstacles that turned simple movement into navigation problems. His knees complained, his back protested. 67 was too old for this. But 67 was also old enough to know that age was just another obstacle, and obstacles were meant to be overcome or bypassed, not surrendered to. 2 hours in, he found the bodies. Not training dummies this time. Real uniforms. Real gear. Arranged in a clearing in poses that mimicked death. 5 figures, ACU camouflage, helmets, weapons nearby. But when Thornton approached carefully, covering angles, he realized they were mannequins. Department store dummies dressed in military equipment in position to look like casualties. The effect was simultaneously absurd and unsettling, like looking at a stage play about war performed by actors who couldn't move. Each mannequin had a name tag, not standard issue names, names from 1972. Tommy Bridger, David Porter, James Martinez, names of men who'd been dead longer than these plastic figures had existed. A note was pinned to the closest dummy's chest. Do you remember their faces, Colonel? Or have 52 years turned them into plastic in your mind too? Thornton's hands shook as he read. Not from fear, from rage that burned cleaner than fear ever could. Rage at the manipulation, at the psychology, at the fundamental violation of using dead men's names as props in whatever twisted lesson Delacroix thought he was teaching. He keyed the GPS, still 3 clicks from last known position. Still alone, still walking into whatever trap had been prepared. The smart move was to call for backup. Let trained teams handle this. Go back to being an old man who'd come to teach and instead learned his past wouldn't stay buried. Thornton kept walking. 3 hours in, the forest changed. Something about the light, the way sound traveled, the absence of bird calls. He'd felt this before. The sensation of entering someone else's territory, where the predator you were tracking had become aware of you and was now tracking back. He found cover behind a fallen oak and waited. 5 minutes. 10. Watching for movement that didn't belong. Listening for sounds that indicated human presence. The forest returned to its normal rhythm slowly. Birds resumed calling. Small animals rustled in underbrush. Either he was alone or whoever was watching had patience to match his. Then a voice called out from somewhere ahead. Male. Familiar. Master Sergeant Frank Delacroix speaking with the parade ground authority of someone who'd spent 3 decades making soldiers listen. Colonel Thornton, I know you're out there. Come ahead. I'm not going to shoot you. Not yet. Where are my soldiers? Thornton called back. Safe, back at base by now, I expect. Steele's efficient when properly motivated. Then what's this about? Conversation. The kind we should have had years ago when I first figured out who you were. Thornton moved forward slowly, weapon ready, eyes scanning. Emerged into a clearing where Delacroix stood in the center, arms at his sides, no weapon visible. The master sergeant looked calm, too calm, the expression of someone who'd made peace with outcomes before they happened. You can lower the rifle, sir. If I wanted you dead, you'd have never made it this far. Thornton didn't lower the weapon. Your father's at base security. He told me what happened. His family, what he did to my squad, all of it. I know. He told me the same stories growing up. Different perspective, though. He told them like lessons about the cost of war, about how violence creates more violence in cycles that span generations. And you learned what from those lessons? That someone has to break the cycle. Question is whether that someone is me or you. Delacroix moved slightly, and Thornton's finger tightened on the trigger. But the master sergeant was just sitting down on a fallen log, movements deliberate and non-threatening. He gestured to another log nearby. Sit, sir, we're both too old to stand through this conversation. Against every instinct, Thornton sat, maintained distance, kept the weapon oriented toward threat, but sat because standing took energy and this conversation might require all he had. My father didn't send me here, Delacroix said. In fact, he specifically told me not to come. Told me his business with you was personal. Told me revenge was a poison that killed the drinker. Wise man. In some ways. In others, he's a broken old man who never stopped fighting a war that ended before I was born. Delacroix picked up a stick, studied it like it contained answers. He adopted me when I was 6, after my birth parents died in a car accident. Gave me a home, a name, a purpose, and all the while he carried this weight, this guilt about what he'd done to American soldiers, about how the war had taken his real family, about how surviving meant living with ghosts. Sounds familiar? Yeah, I figured it would. That's why I'm here. Not to hurt you, not to teach you a lesson, but to ask a question that neither you nor my father has been able to answer. What question? How do we stop being defined by the worst thing that happened to us? The words hit like precision fire. Thornton felt them impact in his chest where 52 years of guilt had calcified into armor that protected nothing and prevented everything. He stared at Delacroix, seeing not an enemy, but a mirror reflecting a different face wearing the same haunted expression. You spent 30 years in the Army, Thornton said slowly. Rose to Master Sergeant, trained thousands of soldiers, all while knowing your father killed American POWs. Every day, every time I put on the uniform, every time I saluted the flag, I carried that knowledge like a second skin. Why stay? Because I thought if I served honorably, it would somehow balance his sins. Thought if I saved enough soldiers, trained them well enough, it would cancel out the ones he killed. Took me 20 years to realize that's not how it works. You can't balance books written in blood. Delacroix tossed the stick aside, looked directly at Thornton with eyes that had seen too much and understood more than was comfortable. Just like you can't train enough soldiers to bring back the 11 you think you let die. Can't be hard enough or demanding enough or prepare them thoroughly enough to make Tommy Bridger stop calling your name in dreams. That's not how guilt works, Colonel. Guilt doesn't want payment. It wants company. So what do you want from me? I want you to answer the question my father never could. When he looks at you, he sees the soldier who survived by hiding, the coward who chose himself over his squad. But when I look at your record, I see something different. I see a soldier who survived that ambush, then spent 3 more years bringing entire companies home from situations that should have killed them all. I see someone who earned that silver star by learning from failure instead of being destroyed by it. Delacroix stood, moved closer. Thornton tracked him with the rifle but didn't fire. So which is true, Colonel? Are you the coward who hid in the mud? Or are you the hero who learned from that moment and spent 50 years trying to make it right? Both. Neither. I don't know. That's the first honest thing I've heard from you. Because here's what I've figured out watching my father carry his guilt and watching you carry yours. You're both so focused on what you did wrong that you can't see what you did right. He gave me a life. raised me with love despite his pain, taught me honor even though he'd done dishonorable things. And you've spent 5 decades making sure other soldiers don't repeat your mistake. That's not penance, that's purpose. Thunder rolled in the distance, weather moving in. The forest grew darker as clouds blocked the sun. Somewhere a branch cracked and both men tensed before realizing it was just wind. You set up this whole scenario, Thornton said. The training exercise going wrong, the fake casualties, the bodies with their names. Why? Because watching you this week, I saw the same thing I see when I look at my father. Someone who's alive but not living. Someone who's so busy carrying ghosts that they forgot how to set them down. I thought maybe if I forced you to face it, forced you to walk into the situation that broke you, you might finally understand something crucial. What's that? That Tommy Bridger and the others didn't die because you were a coward. They died because war is chaos, and sometimes chaos wins. You survived not because you were weak, but because you made the only choice that let anyone survive. And every soldier you've trained since then, every life you've helped save through hard training and honest preparation, that's Tommy's legacy too, because you learned from him. The words should have felt like absolution, should have lifted weight. Instead, they felt like exposure, like having armor stripped away to reveal wounds that had never healed, had just been covered by scar tissue and time. You don't get to forgive me, Thornton said quietly. You weren't there. No, but my father was. And he told me something yesterday before he turned himself in. He said that the hardest person to watch die wasn't the soldier who fought. It was the one who accepted death. The one who looked at him with understanding instead of hate. Who said, "It's okay, tell my family I love them." Who made peace with the end. Tommy! He was the last, wasn't he? The one my father made you watch. The one who called your name, hoping you'd come. Thornton's vision blurred. 52 years and the memory was still fresh as yesterday. Tommy bound to a tree, face swollen from beatings but eyes still alive, still hoping, looking in Thornton's direction even though he couldn't have known Thornton was there, calling his name like a prayer. Jimmy, don't let me die alone. And Thornton, 20 meters away, covered in mud, making himself small, making himself invisible, making himself survive while his best friend died asking for him. He saw me, Thornton whispered. At the end, his eyes found mine. He knew I was there, knew I wasn't coming, and he just nodded like he understood, like he forgave me before I had anything to be forgiven for. And you've spent 52 years hating yourself for accepting that forgiveness. The rifle lowered. Thornton's hands shook too badly to hold it steady. The weight was suddenly too much. Not the weapon, the other weight, the one that had nothing to do with metal and everything to do with memory. Delacroix sat back down on his log, gave Thornton space to break without an audience close enough to see details. My father's dying, Delacroix said after a long silence. Cancer, stage 4, 6 months maybe. That's why he came to find you, not for revenge, for closure. He wanted to look at the man who'd defined so much of his guilt and see if that man had found peace. Because if you had, maybe there was hope for him. I haven't found peace. I know. Neither has he, but maybe that's okay. Maybe the men who carry these weights aren't supposed to find peace. Maybe they're just supposed to keep walking, keep serving, keep making sure the next generation doesn't have to carry the same burden. That's a cold philosophy. It's a survival philosophy, and we're both survivors, aren't we? You and me and my father. We survived things that should have killed us, not just physically, emotionally, morally. We survived the moments that break people, and now we get to decide what that survival means. Thunder rolled closer. First drops of rain began falling, cold, heavy, the kind that turned fire roads to mud and easy terrain to obstacle courses. Both men ignored it. What happens now? Thornton asked. Now you go back to base, finish your training, teach those soldiers what you know. But maybe this time, you teach them something you never taught before. What's that? That survival isn't the same as winning. That coming home doesn't mean you succeeded. That carrying guilt is different from earning it. And that the bravest thing a soldier can do is keep serving even after the war breaks them. Delacroix stood, offered his hand. Thornton stared at it for a long moment. The hand of a man whose father had killed his friends. The hand of a soldier who'd spent 30 years proving he was more than his father's sins. The hand of someone offering not forgiveness, but understanding. Thornton took it. They shook once, Erwisham, Reaperlo. Then Delacroix stepped back. Master Sergeant, Thornton said, "You're not going back to base, are you?" "No, sir." "What I did today, setting up unauthorized scenarios, compromising a training exercise, bringing my father into this, that's not something the Army forgives. And honestly, I'm tired. 30 years of trying to balance scales that don't balance. I think it's time I figure out who Frank Delacroix is when he's not Master Sergeant Delacroix." "Where will you go?" "North, Canada maybe. Somewhere cold. Somewhere that doesn't remind me of Georgia or wars or any of it. My father will need care soon. I'll make sure he gets it. But away from here, away from the wait. They'll come looking for you. I know. That's why I'm telling you to wait 2 hours before you report this conversation. Give me time to disappear, not because I'm running from justice, but because I'm running towards something else. Peace, maybe. Or at least the attempt to find it." Thornton nodded slowly. It was wrong by regulations, wrong by law, wrong by every standard the military held. But it was right by the older code, the one that said sometimes mercy mattered more than rules. 2 hours, Thornton agreed. "Thank you, sir. And Colonel, for what it's worth, Tommy Bridger made the right call, telling you it was okay, forgiving you for surviving. Because you used that survival to save hundreds of others. That's not cowardice. That's legacy." Delacroix walked away, disappeared into forest that accepted him like he'd been born there. Thornton sat alone in the rain, letting it wash over him, too tired to seek shelter, too numb to care about being wet. Thunder spoke overhead. Lightning answered. The storm intensified. And in the chaos of water and sound, something in Thornton's chest loosened. Not healed, but loosened. Like a knot that had been pulled tight for 52 years, finally getting a fraction of slack. He sat for the promised 2 hours. Marked time by counting seconds between lightning and thunder. Watched the storm pass. Watched sunlight return in shafts that looked like searchlights, marking the way home. Then he stood, picked up his rifle, checked his GPS, started walking back toward base, toward soldiers who needed training, toward commanders who'd demand explanations, toward whatever came next. But this time he walked differently, still carrying ghosts, but carrying them like honored dead instead of accusations. Because maybe Delacroix was right. Maybe the point wasn't to forget or forgive himself. Maybe the point was to remember and serve anyway. The walk back took 3 hours, long enough for his clothes to dry, long enough for his mind to process what had happened, long enough to realize that closure wasn't an event. It was a direction, and for the first time in 52 years, he was pointing the right way. He emerged from the tree line at 1700 hours. Base security spotted him immediately. Vehicles converged. Steele arrived at a run, weapon drawn, looking for threats that weren't there. "Colonel, where's Delacroix?" "Gone, north," he said. "He's got maybe 4 hours head start." "Why didn't you call it in?" "Because he earned the right to choose his own ending. And because sometimes the rules matter less than doing right." Steele lowered his weapon, expression caught between respect and frustration. "You know I have to report this." "I know, and I'll take whatever consequences come. But that man spent 30 years serving honorably while carrying his father's sins. He deserved better than being arrested in the forest like a criminal. He compromised a training exercise, risked soldier safety. He saved soldier safety because he made me face something I needed to face. And now I can teach them what they actually need instead of what I've been pretending they need." Chen appeared, running across the compound. Captain's face flushed from exertion and stress. "Sir, thank God you're back. The soldiers have been asking about you, demanding to know what happened." I didn't know what to tell them. Tell them the truth, that their training was interrupted by old men fighting old wars, and that starting tomorrow, they're going to learn from someone who finally understands what he's actually teaching. Back in his quarters that evening, Thornton sat at the small desk and wrote, not a report, not an explanation, a letter. To Tommy Bridger's sister, who'd written him once 10 years after the war, asking what her brother's last moments had been like. He'd never answered that letter. Couldn't face writing the words. Couldn't admit what those last moments had actually been. Now he wrote everything. The ambush, the capture, the torture, the way Tommy had looked at him at the end, the forgiveness in his eyes, the nod that said it was okay to survive. And he wrote something else, something he'd never told anyone. That Tommy's choice to forgive had saved more lives than Tommy would ever know. Because it gave Thornton a reason to keep going, to learn from failure, to become the soldier who brought people home instead of the soldier who hid while others died. That Tommy's last act hadn't been dying, it had been teaching, and the lesson had taken 52 years to fully understand but was worth every minute of the wait. He sealed the letter, addressed it to an address that might not be current, stamped it, left it on the desk for mailing tomorrow. Some messages were worth sending even if they arrived decades late. Sleep came easier that night. Not dreamless, never dreamless, but different. Tommy still appeared, still called his name. But this time when Thornton reached the spot where he'd hidden, he didn't hide. He stood, walked forward, reached Tommy's side. And Tommy smiled. Took you long enough. Sorry, I'm slow. You saved them, though, all those others. That's what I wanted. That's why I told you it was okay. I know. Took me 52 years to figure it out. Better late than never, Jimmy. Better late than never. Thornton woke at 0300, the nightmare hour. But this time he didn't feel the crushing weight. Didn't reach for the bottle he'd stopped touching 19 years ago. Just lay in the dark, breathing steady, feeling something that might have been peace, or at least the distant cousin of peace. The first quiet in a war that had lasted longer than most wars had right to last. Morning came gray and cold. Thornton dressed in uniform that felt different somehow. Same fabric, same cut. But wearing it felt less like penance and more like purpose. The soldiers assembled at 0700, all 32 of them, looking at him with questions they'd been forbidden to ask. He stood before them, an old man who'd walked into the woods carrying 52 years of guilt and come back carrying something lighter. Listen up. What happened yesterday was complicated. Old business from old wars getting mixed into new training. That's been handled. What matters now is what you learned. He paused. Let them sit with uncertainty. Let them understand that not every question had clean answers. War is chaos. Training tries to prepare you for chaos. But some things can't be trained, can't be simulated, can't be taught in classrooms or exercises. You have to learn them in moments when everything goes wrong and you have to decide who you are. Torres raised her hand. Sir, what did you learn? The question hung in morning air that smelled like rain and pine needles. Thornton thought about lying, about giving them the approved answer, about maintaining the distance between instructor and student that regulations recommended. Instead, he told the truth. I learned that surviving isn't the same as winning, that coming home doesn't mean you succeeded, that the people you lose stay with you forever, and that's not weakness. That's memory. That's honor. And that the best way to carry the dead is to make sure their death teaches something that keeps others alive. He looked at each face, young, uncertain, hoping he'd give them the formula, the checklist, the guaranteed method for surviving what was coming, knowing he couldn't, knowing no one could, knowing all he could do was be honest about the cost and hope that honesty made them stronger. Tomorrow we continue training, hard training, the kind that pushes you past comfortable, but not because I'm trying to break you, because I'm trying to show you what you're capable of when everything breaks, because the enemy doesn't care about your limits. War doesn't care about your feelings. Combat doesn't care if you're ready, but I care. And I'm going to make sure that when you face chaos, you have enough training to function anyway. Ortega spoke up. Sir, will Master Sergeant Delacroix be joining us? No, he's moved on to other duties, but his lessons remain. And one of those lessons is that sometimes the hardest thing a soldier does is choose to keep serving even after the service breaks them. Remember that when things get hard, when you want to quit, when you think you can't take anymore. Remember that the soldiers who made it home from the worst wars weren't the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones who kept going when giving up would have been easier. He dismissed them to breakfast, watched them walk away in small groups, talking quietly, processing. Chen approached from the side. That was good, sir. Real. They needed to hear it. Captain, I owe you an apology. I've been pushing methods without explaining why. Criticizing your training without offering alternatives. That changes now. Sir, I'd like to work with you, not against you. Combine your technical knowledge with my experience. Build something that actually prepares them for what's coming. Chen studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. I'd like that, Colonel. These soldiers deserve the best we can give them. And maybe that's both of us working together instead of separately. They shook. 2 generations, 2 philosophies, finding common ground and shared purpose. The rest of the day was administrative. Debriefs, paperwork, Statements about Delacroix's disappearance that carefully avoided mentioning the 2-hour head start. Steele pulled strings, called favors, made the investigation focus on what mattered instead of what didn't. By evening, the official story was simple. Master Sergeant Delacroix had experienced a psychological crisis related to his father's past. He'd gone AWOL. Efforts to locate him would continue but weren't priority given. No one was harmed. Unofficially, Steele told Thornton that Delacroix had crossed into Canada 6 hours after leaving the forest, that he'd called his father from a payphone near the border, that Nguyen Van Thieu had cried, that they'd made peace over a connection that transcended distance. "Your call, Jim," Steele said. "We can keep looking or we can let this one go." "Let it go. He's earned it." Agreed. That evening, Thornton visited Thieu one final time. The old man was being processed for release. No charges, no detention, just an elderly refugee who'd made poor choices about seeking closure. He looked smaller than before, older, like confessing had taken physical weight. "Your son is safe," Thornton said. "I know, he called, said you let him go." "Wait," because he was right, about carrying guilt, about serving despite being broken, about how survival becomes legacy if you choose to make it so. Thieu smiled sadly. "My English name is Nathan Thomas. Did you know why I chose Thomas?" "No, because of Tommy, your friend. He was kind, even at the end, told me about his home, his family, his girl, made me see him as human instead of enemy. That haunted me more than any of the others, because killing the human is harder than killing the soldier. He was good at being human, better than most. I am glad we talked, James. I do not know if I am forgiven, but I know I tried to make peace. That will have to be enough. It's more than most of us get." They didn't shake hands, didn't embrace, just nodded to each other with understanding that transcended easy categories like friend or enemy. Two old men who'd been shaped by the same war in different ways, who'd carried the weight differently, but who'd both finally set down just enough to keep walking. Thornton left the base that night with permission to stay the remaining month of his agreed time, drove to his quarters, found the letter to Tommy's sister still waiting on the desk, added a postscript. "Your brother saved my life by forgiving me for surviving. I spent 52 years trying to earn that forgiveness. Today I realized he gave it freely. No earning required, just acceptance, just grace. I hope this letter finds you well. I hope you know that Tommy's last act was teaching and that his student finally learned the lesson." He mailed it the next morning, watched it disappear into the postal system that would carry words across decades and distance, knowing they might never arrive, knowing arrival wasn't the point. The point was sending them. The point was trying. Training resumed. Different now. Thornton and Chen working together, combining hard with smart, demanding with understanding, pushing soldiers to their limits while explaining why limits mattered, building not just warriors but humans who could warrior when necessary and human when possible. Private Ortega thrived under the new approach, found discipline without losing edge. Specialist Torres grew stronger. Private Jackson found courage. Sergeant Martinez became the leader he'd been trying to be all along. And Thornton taught, really taught, not penance, not atonement, just purpose, just service, just passing on lessons bought in blood and refined through 52 years of carrying them. 3 weeks later, the letter came back. Return to sender. Address unknown. Tommy's sister had moved, or died, or simply disappeared into a life that had moved on from brothers who died young in forgotten wars. Thornton kept the letter anyway, filed it with the photograph of 11 dead men, with the dog tags he still carried, with the memories that had shifted from weights to wings. Because maybe that was the point. Maybe remembering wasn't about staying trapped in the past. Maybe it was about bringing the past forward, letting it inform the present instead of define it, teaching from scars instead of hiding them. The month ended, Thornton's commitment completed. Price offered to extend. Thornton declined. 3 months was the deal. I've done what I came to do. And what was that? Figure out if an old coward could become an old teacher. Turns out he could, but now it's time for him to go home. Will you come back? If you need me, but I think Captain Chen has this handled. He's better than I gave him credit for, better than I was at his age. You trained a generation, Jim. That counts for something. 32 soldiers in 3 months. That's not a generation. No, but they'll train others. Who'll train others? That's how legacies work. Not in what you do, in what you enable others to do. Thornton drove away from Fort Benning on a morning that felt like every other morning except different. Georgia pines gave way to Tennessee hills. Base gave way to home. Military to civilian. Teacher to whatever came next. His small house waited. Same rooms, same furniture, same photograph on the kitchen table. But when he looked at it now, he saw different things. Not 11 men he'd failed. 11 men who'd taught him. Who'd given him purpose through their absence. Who'd forgiven him before he knew he needed forgiving. Tommy's face smiled from 52 years ago. Young, hopeful, alive in the way that only photographs preserve. Frozen at 20 before life could complicate or war could end. Thornton touched the frame gently. I finally get it, brother. You weren't giving me permission to survive. You were giving me responsibility. To learn, to teach, to make sure your death mattered by helping others live. Took me too long to understand, but I'm there now. The photograph didn't answer, but somehow in morning light filtering through Tennessee windows, Tommy's smile looked less like accusation and more like approval. 52 years, the weight hadn't disappeared. Probably never would. But it had shifted from burden to purpose, from guilt to legacy, from survival to service. And James Thornton, 67 years old, retired colonel, survivor of wars that wouldn't end, and student of lessons that took lifetimes to learn, finally understood what Tommy had tried to teach him at the end. That forgiveness wasn't something you earned. It was something you accepted. And once accepted, you passed forward. Through teaching, through service, through making sure that the next generation learned from your mistakes instead of repeating them. He made coffee, sat on the front porch, watched the hills hold their secrets. And for the first time in 52 years, James Thornton felt something that might have been peace, or at least the beginning of it. The first quiet morning in a war that had finally started to end. The phone call came 3 weeks after Thornton returned to Tennessee. Morning light was still gray when the ring shattered silence that had become comfortable. He'd been awake for an hour already, coffee going cold on the porch railing, watching deer move through the property like they owned it. Maybe they did. Possession was 9/10 of the law, and they'd been there longer than his 30 years. General Price's voice carried urgency that made Thornton sit straighter. Jim, I need you back at Benning, today if possible. What's wrong? We have a situation, similar to what happened with Tew, another veteran from the other side, but this one's more complicated. How complicated? He's demanding to meet with Lieutenant Sarah Mackenzie. Says her father called an artillery strike that killed his family in Iraq. Says she inherits the sin and he wants her to understand the cost. Thornton closed his eyes. The cycles never ended, just repeated with different players wearing the same wounds. Mackenzie, she's the one who was observing during the exercise. Correct. 29 years old, Ranger qualified, one of our best young officers, and she's carrying her father's death heavier than most people realize. What happened to her father? Captain Daniel Mackenzie, Marine Corps, Fallujah, 2004. Called artillery on a building believed to be insurgent stronghold. Killed 6 combatants and 4 civilians. Investigation cleared him, but he never forgave himself. Drank himself to death by 2010. Sarah joined up partly to honor him, partly to understand him. And now someone from that day wants to make her understand differently. His name is Ahmed al-Rashid, 58 years old, former translator who worked with U.S. forces. Lost his 12-year-old son in that strike and became a U.S. citizen in 2008, lives in Columbus, been watching Sarah's career apparently, waiting for the right moment. What's the threat level? Unknown. He's not threatening violence, just requesting a meeting. Mediated, says he wants to share his son's story so she understands what her father's heroism looked like from the receiving end. Thornton stood, already calculating drive time. I'll be there by 1400. Jim, I'm not ordering you. You've done enough, but you're the only person I know who's navigated this kind of situation successfully. Successfully is generous. Thew and I reached understanding. That's not the same as resolution. It's more than most people get. That's what Mackenzie needs. Someone who understands that some wounds don't heal, they just stop bleeding as much. The drive south took 7 hours. Thornton pushed the speed limit, stopping only for gas and coffee that tasted like regret. His mind worked through scenarios, through approaches, through the fundamental problem of inherited guilt, and how one generation's choices became another's burden. Sarah Mackenzie's file lay on the passenger seat. Price had sent it electronically, but Thornton had printed it because paper felt more real than pixels. 29. West Point graduate. 2 deployments to Afghanistan, exemplary record. Fast track for command. And carrying a father's ghost that apparently showed in ways her superiors had learned to look past. One note from her last evaluation stood out. LT Mackenzie demonstrates exceptional tactical competence but occasionally hesitates when calling for fire support. Recommend additional training to build confidence in supporting assets. Thornton recognized that hesitation, recognized what it meant. She wasn't lacking confidence in the weapons. She was lacking confidence in herself, terrified of repeating her father's mistake, of making the call that seemed right in the moment but revealed itself as wrong when the smoke cleared. He arrived at Fort Benning at 13:45. Price met him at the gate personally, climbed into the passenger's seat without preamble. She's in my office, been there since 0700 when I told her about Ahmed's request. She wants to meet him. That's brave or foolish. Maybe both. But I think she needs this, needs to face it instead of carrying it. And if it breaks her, then we pick up the pieces. But Jim, she's already broken. Just doing a better job hiding it than most. Price's office was standard general quarters, functional. Awards and photos on walls that told stories of a career spent serving. Sarah Mackenzie stood when they entered, military bearing that couldn't quite hide the tremor in her shoulders. She was smaller than her file suggested, maybe 5'6", lean in the way that came from running problems off instead of solving them. Lieutenant, this is Colonel Thornton, retired. He's going to help us navigate this situation. She shook his hand, grip firm, eyes that tried to hold steady but showed cracks around the edges. Sir, General Price told me about you, about what happened with the other veteran. Different situation, but similar principles. How are you holding up? Honestly, sir, I don't know. Part of me wants to meet this man, hear his story, understand what my father did from the other side. Part of me wants to run and never stop running. Both parts are valid. Question is which one serves you better. The general says you might have insight because you carry something similar. Thornton glanced at Price, who had the grace to look slightly apologetic for sharing information without permission. But it was tactical, smart, building trust through vulnerability. Classic command technique. I carry failure from a long time ago. People died who shouldn't have died. I survived who shouldn't have survived. Been living with that math for 52 years. Does it get easier? No, but you get stronger at carrying it, and sometimes you find ways to make the weight mean something beyond just pain. She sat back down heavily. Younger than his daughter would have been if he'd had children. Younger than many of the soldiers he'd trained. Old enough to have seen combat. Young enough to still believe understanding could fix what was broken. My father never talked about Fallujah, not the specifics, just came home different. Angrier, sadder, started drinking. By the time I was 16, he was drunk more than sober. By the time I was 20, he was dead. Liver failure, the doctor said. Suicide by bottle, I knew. And you joined the Marines to understand him. Army, sir, he was Marines. I couldn't follow directly in his footsteps. Felt like I'd be pretending to be him instead of honoring him. That's wisdom beyond your years. That's therapy beyond my pay grade. She smiled slightly. Bitter humor, the kind that kept soldiers sane when sanity was negotiable. Ahmed al-Rashid. When I heard the name, I researched everything. Found articles about the strike. Found the after-action report my father wrote. Found his statement to the investigation. And sir, he followed every protocol, did everything right. The intelligence said that building was hostile. The ROE authorized the strike. He made the correct call by every standard we measure. But 4 civilians died, including a 12-year-old boy named Omar, who wanted to be a doctor. And my father knew their names, had their names in his personal effects when he died, wrote them down, carried them, just like you carry your 11. Thornton felt the impact of recognition, the understanding that guilt didn't require wrongdoing, just required consequence and conscience. What do you want from this meeting, Lieutenant? I want to apologize for something I didn't do. I want to understand if that's even possible. I want to hear about Omar al-Rashid, so he's more than a name in a report. I want to see if facing this helps or just makes it worse. It'll probably do both. Then I'd rather know than wonder. Price set up the meeting for the following morning. Base chapel, neutral ground, chaplain present, security outside, but not obvious. Ahmed al-Rashid was American citizen, no criminal record, no indication of threat. But Price had learned from the TO situation that old wounds carried unpredictable edges. That evening, Thornton sat with Sarah in the officers' club. Quiet corner, two people trying to prepare for a conversation that couldn't be prepared for. She nursed a club soda. He drank coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. Tell me about your father, Thornton said. Not the Marine, the man. She considered the question like it was tactical problem with moving variables. He was kind before the war. Funny, told terrible dad jokes, coached my soccer team even though he didn't know soccer. After he came back, the kindness was still there sometimes, but buried under something heavier, like he was carrying weight none of us could see. Did you ever ask him about it? Once, I was 14, found him crying in the garage at 3 in the morning. Asked what was wrong. He just said sometimes the cost of doing right feels exactly like doing wrong. Didn't understand it then, understand it too well now. Have you deployed? 2 tours, Afghanistan, both times in leadership positions. Both times I had to make calls about fire support, about whether to engage, about whether the intelligence was good enough to risk civilian casualties for military necessity. And I hesitated. Every single time my NCOs noticed, my commander noticed, put it in my evaluation with gentle language about building confidence. But we all knew what it meant. I was terrified of becoming my father, of making the call that looked right but ended up killing children. Did your hesitation ever cost American lives? She went very still, eyes fixed on the table, hands clenched around the glass. Kandahar, 2019. We had a patrol pinned down. Good intel on enemy position. I had authority to call close air support, had the aircraft on station, had confirmation that building was hostile, but I hesitated, wanted to be absolutely sure. Took me 4 minutes to make the call. 4 minutes. What happened in those 4 minutes? 2 of my soldiers took fire, 1 KIA, 1 lost his leg. Both would have been fine if I'd called the strike when I first had the opportunity. So I carry that. I carry my father's guilt in my own guilt. And I don't know which is heavier. Thornton reached across the table. Didn't touch her. Just made the gesture available. Sometimes proximity was enough. Tomorrow you're going to meet a man who carries similar weight from the opposite side. He lost his son to a call your father made. You lost soldiers to a call you didn't make fast enough. Neither of you are wrong. Both of you are suffering. The question isn't who deserves forgiveness. It's whether understanding helps. Does it? I'm still figuring that out. But I think maybe it does. Not healing, just helping. There's a difference. Morning came cold. Georgia winter that never quite decided if it was serious about the season. Thornton and Sarah walked to the chapel at 0800. Price met them outside with another officer. Captain Robert Chen, looking uncomfortable in the formal role of official observer. Lieutenant Colonel Mr. Al-Rashid is already inside. Chaplain is with him. We'll be in the back if you need anything. The chapel was small, non-denominational, the kind of space that tried to serve everyone and ended up serving no one specifically. Wooden pews, simple altar, stained glass windows that let in colored light without depicting anything that might offend any particular faith. Ahmed al-Rashid sat in the front row. 58 looked older on him, gray hair thinning, shoulders bent like they carried weight only he could feel. He wore a suit, outdated but clean, the uniform of someone who didn't own many suits but took care of the ones he had. He stood when they entered, turned. Eyes found Sarah with recognition that crossed distance and years. This wasn't their first meeting in his mind. He'd been watching, waiting, building toward this moment for however long he'd known she existed. Lieutenant Mackenzie, thank you for meeting me. His English was perfect. American accent worn into the original Syrian patterns until they blended into something that belonged nowhere completely. Sarah moved forward slowly. Thornton stayed back, close enough to intervene, far enough to let this happen without his shadow. Mr. Al-Rashid, I'm told you wanted to talk about my father, about what happened in Fallujah. Please sit. This will take time. They sat in adjacent pews, turned toward each other. Thornton took a position 3 rows back where he could see both faces. The chaplain, a major with kind eyes and too many combat tours showing in his bearing, remained near the altar, present but not participating. Ahmed pulled out a photograph, worn, handled so many times the edges had softened. He held it carefully like it might disintegrate if treated roughly. This is my son, Omar. He was 12 when he died. Smart boy, top of his class, loved science, wanted to be doctor, help people. Sarah took the photo with hands that shook slightly, studied it, Boy with dark hair and bright smile holding up a science fair trophy. Universal image of childhood achievement. Could have been any culture, any country, just a kid being proud of something he'd worked hard to accomplish. He's beautiful. He was before your father killed him. The words weren't accusatory, just factual. Statement of what happened without judgment attached. Somehow that made them cut deeper. Sarah's face went pale, but she didn't look away from the photograph. Mr. Al-Rashid, I know an apology isn't enough. I know it doesn't bring Omar back. But I am sorry, more sorry than words can carry, for his death, for your loss, for the pain that decision caused. Your father followed orders, yes? He had intelligence saying my home was hostile? Yes. The report said there was evidence of insurgent activity, weapons cache, communications equipment. The building matched the profile. It was all true. My neighbors were insurgents. They stored weapons in buildings near ours, used our neighborhood as cover. We were trapped, could not leave without seeming disloyal to them, could not stay without risk from your military. We were civilians caught between wars we did not choose. Ahmed took the photo back, looked at it like he was seeing Omar alive, instead of frozen in silver-hallowed memory. The morning of the strike, Omar was doing homework, mathematics. He struggled with mathematics. I was helping him. My wife was cooking. My daughter was reading. Normal family doing normal things in a place where normal died years before. Your father's artillery was accurate, very professional, killed the insurgents quickly. But our house was close. The explosion knocked down our wall. Rebar and concrete fell on Omar, crushed him. He died asking me why the Americans hated us. I could not answer because I did not know. Sarah was crying silently, tears running down her face without sound, the kind of crying that came from places too deep for noise. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I do not tell you this for apology. I tell you so you understand, so you know that your father's correct decision killed my son. That following protocol and doing duty and serving country can all be true while also destroying innocent life. War is not clean. No one who fights it is innocent. Not your father, not me, not the insurgents, not Omar. We all paid prices we did not choose. He folded the photograph carefully, returned it to his wallet like placing it in a shrine. I became American citizen in 2008. You know why? No, sir. Because I wanted to understand the country that killed my son. Wanted to see if Americans were monsters or just people making hard choices in impossible situations. I studied your military, your rules, your procedures, and I learned something important. What's that? Your father suffered too. I researched him, found his name in records, found he died young from drinking, found he carried my son's name in his pocket when he died. Just like I carry Omar's photo, we were both fathers who lost sons. His son just took longer to die. The words hung in morning light filtering through stained glass, truth that cut clean because it was spoken without malice. Just an observation. Just one broken man recognizing another broken man across enemy lines that had blurred into irrelevance. I have another son, Ahmed continued. Kareem, he is 25 now. He wants to join United States Army, to serve the country that killed his brother. I told him no for many years. But yesterday I decided to tell him yes. Sarah looked up sharply. Why, Mo? Because General Price showed me something. He showed me that your military is trying to change, to learn, to prevent more Omars. And he told me about you, about how you hesitate before calling fire, about how you carry your father's guilt even though you did nothing wrong. And I realized something. What? That you are not your father's sin. You are his attempt at redemption. You joined to honor him by not repeating his mistake, by being more careful, by carrying the weight he could not carry. That is not weakness, Lieutenant. That is wisdom. Ahmed stood slowly, joints stiff from sitting, from age, from carrying 20 years of grief in bones that had never been designed for such loads. I came here to tell you that I forgive you for something you did not do. I forgive your father for something he had to do. And I hope you will forgive yourself for trying so hard not to repeat his mistakes, that you made different ones. How do I do that? By understanding that there are no perfect choices, only choices. Your father chose to follow intelligence and protocol. You choose to hesitate and verify. Both choices have costs. Both are attempts to serve while staying human. Neither is wrong. Both are just hard. He offered his hand. Sarah took it. They shook with the formality of two people acknowledging shared grief without pretending it could be fixed. Then Ahmed turned to leave. "Wait," Sarah called. "Your son, Kareem, if he joins, if he needs someone to help him, to guide him, I would like to volunteer." Ahmed stopped, turned back, eyes searching her face for something, finding it apparently because he nodded slowly. He would be honored, and I would be grateful, because teaching him to serve without teaching him to hate is what I cannot do. Maybe you can. After he left, Sarah sat in the pew staring at her hands. Thornton moved forward, sat beside her, gave her space to process. The chaplain approached with water. She took it, but didn't drink. "How do you do this, sir? How do you carry it and keep serving?" "You just do. Every day. You wake up and you choose to make the wait mean something. You teach. You prepare. You make sure the next generation learns from your mistakes without repeating them. It's not healing. It's not resolution. It's just purpose." Is that enough? Some days. Other days, it has to be because there's nothing else available. They sat in silence. Outside, the base continued its rhythm. Soldiers training, equipment moving, the machinery of military readiness turning like it always turned. Inside, two people sat with ghosts that had grown slightly quieter, but no less present. Price was waiting in his office when they returned. Chen had coffee ready. Everyone moved with the careful precision of people trying not to break something fragile. Sarah looked steadier, not healed, just less actively breaking. "How'd it go?" Price asked. "Hard, necessary. He forgave me for something I didn't do. Not sure how to feel about that." Feel grateful. Forgiveness is rare. Even rarer when it crosses battle sinews. Price pulled out a folder, official Army documents. Which brings me to the actual reason I asked Thornton back, beyond the immediate situation with Ahmed. "Sir, what happened with Tew and Ahmed got me thinking. What if we formalized this? Created a program where former adversaries come to Fort Benning, teach our soldiers, share their perspective, help us understand war from the other side." Thornton sat forward. "That's radical. Command would never approve." "Command might if we present it right, as part of cultural awareness training, as preparation for complex operations, as reconciliation initiative that builds diplomatic bridges while improving combat effectiveness." Chen spoke up. "Sir, with respect, there's no doctrine for this, no precedent. We'd be creating something entirely new." "Exactly. Because current doctrine produces soldiers who are tactically proficient but culturally blind, who can clear a building but can't understand why the people in that building hate them. This changes that." "By bringing the people who fought us into our training?" Sarah asked. "By bringing the people we fought into our understanding, making them human instead of targets, teaching soldiers to see the enemy as people making choices in impossible circumstances instead of abstractions on range targets." Thornton looked at Price with new respect. This wasn't just about preventing incidents. It was about fundamental change in how military prepared people for war, teaching them to fight smarter by understanding the humans they fought against. "You're talking about revolution dressed up as training." "I'm talking about evolution. We've gotten very good at killing. Maybe it's time we got equally good at understanding why we have to kill, and maybe eventually how to avoid it." The discussion continued for hours. Logistics, legal considerations, how to vet former adversaries, how to present this to chain of command without triggering immediate rejection, how to structure training so it enhanced readiness instead of compromising it. By evening, the outline existed. Reconciliation training program, former adversaries paired with American veterans, teaching cultural awareness, sharing combat experiences from both sides, helping soldiers understand that enemy was human, that war created trauma for everyone involved, that the skills to fight effectively and the wisdom to avoid fighting unnecessarily weren't contradictory, but complementary. Sarah volunteered to coordinate. Chen agreed to handle tactical implementation. Price would navigate political waters, and Thornton reluctantly agreed to serve as senior advisor. Drawing on his experience with Tew, with Delacroix, with 52 years of carrying enemy faces that had become human only in retrospect. "This is going to be controversial," Chen warned. "Everything worth doing is," Price replied. "But we're not asking permission to try. We're asking forgiveness if it fails." That's how change happens in institutions this old. That night, Thornton sat in his temporary quarters writing another letter. Not to Tommy's sister this time, to Delacroix, wherever he was, whatever life he'd built in exile from service that had defined him. He wrote about Ahmed, about Sarah, about the program taking shape, about how the cycles of violence and guilt might finally be breaking. Not ending, never ending, but bending towards something that looked like understanding instead of just repeating the same wounds with different faces. He wrote about Tommy, about how 52 years later, that moment of forgiveness was still teaching, still opening doors to possibilities that hadn't existed before, still showing that the bravest thing a soldier could do was choose understanding over hate, even when hate would have been easier. He didn't mail the letter, had no address, but writing it helped, crystallized thoughts, made intentions concrete. And maybe somewhere in Canada, Delacroix would feel the echo. The understanding that the work he'd started in that forest clearing was continuing, growing, becoming something larger than any individual's pain. Sleep came eventually, dreamless for once, or at least dreams too quiet to remember. Morning brought new purpose. First meeting with potential program participants, veterans on both sides, American soldiers who'd fought overseas, former adversaries who'd fought them, all coming together to build something that might prevent future Omars, future Tommies, future Sarahs carrying guilt for choices they'd inherited. The meeting room was full, 20 people, mixed backgrounds, mixed languages, mixed experiences of wars that had shaped all of them differently. Thornton stood at the front with Price and Sarah, looked at faces that had been trained to see each other as enemies, that were trying, with visible effort, to see each other as something else. Most of you know why you're here, Price began. Those who don't will figure it out quickly. We're starting a program, teaching soldiers to understand war from perspectives beyond their own, teaching them that the people we fight are human, that understanding enemy doesn't mean sympathizing with enemy. It means fighting smarter because you understand motivations and culture. A hand raised, former Marine, Iraq veteran based on his bearing and the way his eyes tracked threats in a room that contained no threats. Sir, with respect, this sounds like we're teaching soldiers to feel sorry for people trying to kill them. No, Captain. We're teaching them why people try to kill them, so they can anticipate, adapt, and maybe occasionally avoid conflicts that don't need to happen. Understanding creates options. Ignorance just creates casualties. Another hand, this one from an older man, Middle Eastern features, accent that placed him somewhere between Damascus and nowhere. General, I've fought American soldiers for 3 years, killed some, watched friends die to your airstrikes. Why would I help you train more soldiers to do the same? Because maybe you're tired of the cycle. Maybe you're tired of watching your children grow up with same hate you carried. Maybe you want next generation to be smarter than ours was. The man considered, nodded slowly, didn't commit, but didn't refuse. Sarah spoke up. Yesterday I met Ahmed al-Rashid. His son died in an artillery strike my father called. We sat in a chapel and cried about choices neither of us made, but both of us carry. And I realized something. War made us enemies, but grief makes us human. This program isn't about choosing sides. It's about choosing to stop pretending war is simple. The room was quiet, people processing, measuring sincerity against experience that said trust got you killed, but also measuring the weariness that came from carrying hate too long, the exhaustion that came from fighting wars that never ended, just changed locations. One by one they agreed, not all. Some walked out, some refused participation, but enough stayed, enough were tired enough of fighting to try understanding, enough were broken enough by loss to try prevention. The program launched 2 weeks later, small scale, single class of 40 soldiers, 10 former adversaries from different conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, places where America had fought and left and sometimes returned. Veterans on both sides teaching together, sharing combat stories, explaining decisions from perspectives that rarely got heard. It was awkward initially. Soldiers didn't want to humanize people they might face in future conflicts. Former adversaries didn't want to help people who'd invaded their countries. But slowly, through shared vulnerability and honest conversation, something shifted. They started understanding that war wasn't good versus evil. It was people with different perspectives making choices that seemed right from inside their context. That the insurgent protecting his neighborhood from foreign troops felt as justified as the American soldier protecting his squad from insurgent attacks. Both right, both wrong, both human. Thornton watched it happen with something like hope. Fragile, easily crushed, but present. The first green shoot growing through concrete that had been poured 52 years ago when Tommy died and taught him that survival without purpose was just slow dying. 6 weeks in, Sarah approached him after a training session. Colonel Kareem enrolled, Ahmed's son. He's in basic training at Fort Jackson. Should graduate in 8 weeks. How's he doing? Top of his class, but struggling with anger. Drill sergeants say he's motivated but carries something heavy. Sounds familiar. I'd like to mentor him when he finishes basic. Help him channel that anger into service instead of letting it become poison. You sure you're ready for that? No, but Ahmed trusted me with his son, and I think maybe helping Kareem is how I honor Omar. By making sure Omar's brother becomes the doctor Omar wanted to be. Just wearing a uniform while doing it. Thornton nodded approval. The cycle was shifting. Sarah wasn't just carrying her father's guilt. She was transforming it, using it, making it mean something beyond just pain. That was evolution. That was growth. That was what Tommy had tried to teach him before the lesson took root. The program expanded. 3 more classes, 50 soldiers each. Word spread through military community. Some commanders were skeptical, called it soft, called it dangerous, called it teaching soldiers to sympathize with people who wanted to kill Americans. But other commanders saw results, saw soldiers deploying with better cultural awareness, better ability to distinguish between combatants and civilians, better understanding of why conflicts started and how they might be prevented. Fewer incidents, fewer unnecessary casualties on both sides. By month 4, the program had trained 200 soldiers. By month 6, other installations were requesting similar programs. By month 8, it was being discussed at Pentagon level as model for future training. And through it all, Thornton taught. Not tactics, not marksmanship, not the mechanical skills of warfare. He taught context, taught that every enemy was someone's son, someone's father, someone who'd made choices that seemed right from inside their circumstances, even if those choices led to conflict. He taught by sharing Tommy, by sharing the 11 men who'd died, by sharing the 52 years of carrying them, by sharing that guilt and purpose weren't opposites, but partners, that remembering the cost of failure was what made success possible. 3 months after the program started, Thornton received a letter, Canadian postmark, no return address, inside single sheet of paper, Delacroix's handwriting. Colonel, heard about the program. Father is proud. I am proud. You took what broke you and made it teach. That's the legacy Tommy gave you. That's the gift you're giving forward. Thank you for finishing what we started in the forest, for proving that understanding is stronger than hate. May your ghost rest lighter. May your purpose carry longer. May the next generation learn from our mistakes instead of repeating them. No signature. Didn't need one. Thornton read it 3 times, then filed it with Tommy's photograph, with the dog tags, with the accumulated weight of 52 years that had shifted from burden to purpose. That evening, he sat on the porch of his temporary quarters watching Georgia sunset paint the sky colors that existed nowhere else. Price found him there, settled into adjacent chair. Both men watched light fade without speaking. You've done good work here, Jim. We've done work. Good is still being determined. 200 soldiers trained to see enemy as human. That's good by any measure. 200 is a start. There are hundreds of thousands who still see war as simple. Good guys versus bad guys. Us versus them. Can't change everyone, but you change some. That's legacy. Thornton thought about Tommy, about Delacroix, about Ahmed and Sarah and Kareem, about cycles breaking and understanding, spreading, and the possibility that maybe, possibly, the next generation would fight smarter wars or avoid them entirely. Mike, I need to ask you something. Anything. When you pulled me out of that building in Hughes City 56 years ago, did you think I'd end up here? Teaching soldiers that understanding enemy is as important as defeating them? Price laughed quietly. Jim, when I pulled you out of Hugh, I thought you'd end up dead within a week. You were that reckless back then, that angry, that convinced you had nothing to lose. What changed? You did, slowly. After Tommy, after the others, after you decided survival meant something beyond just breathing. You became someone who understood that war's cost had to matter, that the dead had to teach. That's who you became when you stopped being who you were. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that came from shared history and mutual respect. Eventually, Price stood, I'm retiring in 6 months. 42 years is enough. When I go, I'm recommending Sarah take over the program. She's got the vision, the understanding, the ability to turn wounds into wisdom. She'll be good at it, better than good. She'll be what you and I never were, someone who learned the lesson early enough to teach it before the weight became crushing. After Price left, Thornton remained on the porch watching stars emerge, counting them like he'd counted days since Tommy died. 52 years, 19,000 days, each one carrying weight, each one teaching something, each one moving him incrementally toward this moment where burden had become purpose. His phone rang, unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Voice on the other end was young, uncertain, Arabic accent struggling with English. Colonel Thornton, this is Kareem al-Rashid. My father gave me your number. Said you would understand. I need to talk to someone about why I joined, about what I'm carrying, about how to serve without hate. Thornton smiled into the darkness. The cycles were breaking. The wounds were teaching. The understanding was spreading. Not healing, never healing completely, but bending towards something better than endless repetition of the same pain. Kareem, I understand, and I'd be honored to talk, because your father taught me something important, that the children don't have to carry the sins of fathers. They can carry the lessons instead. When do you graduate basic? 6 weeks, sir. Then call me when you get to your first duty station. We'll talk about service, about purpose, about how to carry weight without letting it crush you. And Kareem? Yes, sir. Your brother Omar, he wanted to be doctor, right? Yes, sir. Then you serve in his honor. You heal by protecting. You remember him by making sure other brothers don't die unnecessarily. That's how we break cycles. That's how we make peace with ghosts. The call ended. Thornton sat holding the phone, feeling weight shift again, feeling purpose clarify, feeling the long arc from Tommy's death to this moment where another generation was choosing understanding over hate. The night deepened, stars multiplied, and somewhere in the darkness, James Thornton felt something he hadn't felt in 52 years. Not peace, not absolution, not healing, but something close to all three. Something that felt like Tommy's forgiveness finally taking root, finally teaching the lesson it had been trying to teach all along. That survival was gift. That guilt was teacher. That understanding was weapon more powerful than hate. That the bravest thing a soldier could do was choose to serve even after service broke them. And that legacy wasn't about what you carried. It was about what you passed forward. Lighter, wiser, better. 5 years passed like water through open hands. Some days felt eternal. Others disappeared before Thornton could name them. Time had that quality now. Fluid, unreliable, moving at speeds that defied the clock's mechanical promises. He was 72 years old. The number felt abstract until he looked in mirrors or tried to do things his body had done effortlessly at 50. Then it felt concrete, undeniable. The arithmetic of aging written in joints that complained and muscles that remembered strength they no longer possessed. The reconciliation program had grown beyond anything Price had imagined. 12 installations now, thousands of soldiers trained, former adversaries from 6 different conflicts teaching alongside American veterans. The model had been studied, copied, adapted. What started as radical experiment had become accepted doctrine. But success carried weight of its own. The program needed leadership, needed vision, needed someone who understood both the military necessity and the human cost. Sarah Mackenzie had taken over day-to-day operations 3 years ago when Price finally retired. She was 34 now. Major, fast-tracked for lieutenant colonel, building reputation as officer who saw soldiers as humans first and weapons second. Thornton had transitioned to advisor role, visiting bases, teaching occasional classes, sharing stories that got longer and more detailed as memory aged and compressed time into narratives that might not match perfect accuracy but captured emotional truth. The soldiers listened because he'd earned the right to their attention, because his scars were visible even if the wounds weren't. He was back in Tennessee now, small house in the hills, same place he'd left 5 years ago when Price called. Same photograph on the kitchen table, same ghosts, but the ghosts were quieter now, still present, always present, but speaking in whispers instead of screams. The morning started like every morning. Coffee at dawn, porch watch as light crawled over hills that held their secrets better than he'd ever held his. Birds announced territory. Deer moved through property with the confidence of ownership. The world continued its patterns independent of human drama. His phone rang at 0700, Sarah's number. She called monthly with updates. Program statistics, success stories, occasionally problems that needed his input. But something about this call felt different. The timing, the wait in the silence before she spoke. Colonel, I need to tell you something before you hear it elsewhere. That sounds ominous. General Price passed away last night. Heart attack. Quick, painless, according to the doctors. He was at home. The words hit differently than expected. Not shock. Price had been 70, had served hard, had carried command stress that aged people faster than combat. But still, the finality, the understanding that another connection to the past had severed. When's the service? Friday. Arlington, full military honors. His family asked if you'd speak. Said Mike specifically requested you. Left a letter, apparently. I'll be there. After the call ended, Thornton sat holding dead phone, thinking about Hugh City, about being pulled from a building that was more tomb than structure, about a captain who'd risked his own life to save a private who'd been too angry and reckless to deserve saving, about 56 years of friendship maintained mostly through silence and occasional phone calls when crisis demanded intervention. Price had been constant, rock, foundation, the kind of officer who made military service feel like calling instead of job. And now he was gone, joining ranks of the dead who outnumbered the living in Thornton's memory. The drive to Washington took 11 hours. Thornton made it in 2 days, stopping overnight in Virginia at a motel that smelled like bleach and broken air conditioning. Lying awake watching ceiling shadows while thinking about mortality and legacy and whether anything any of them had done would outlast the generation that did it. Arlington on Friday morning was crisp and clear. November air that promised winter without delivering. Thornton arrived early, wearing dress uniform that barely fit. Weight had shifted over 5 years, muscle to something softer. Chest that had once been barrel now concave. The uniform hung differently, still correct, just aged. Sarah found him at the gravesite. She wore Major's oak leaves with authority that came from competence instead of rank. Looked older than 34. Carried weight that leadership demanded, but her eyes held something new. Purpose, direction. The transformation from carrying burden to using it. Colonel, thank you for coming. Wouldn't miss it. How are you holding up? Price was mentor, friend, the reason I'm still serving instead of drunk like my father. So I'm holding up by not thinking too hard about it. That's valid strategy. They stood in companionable silence watching cemetery fill. Hundreds of people, officers Price had commanded, enlisted soldiers he trained, families spanning multiple generations, the accumulated impact of a life spent serving something larger than self. The service was military precision, honor guard, flag folding, 21-gun salute that echoed across acres of white headstones marking soldiers who'd finished their watch. Chaplain spoke about service and sacrifice, about duty and honor, about man who'd given 42 years to uniform and nation. Then Sarah spoke, not from notes, from heart, about officer who'd seen her potential before she recognized it, who'd pushed her past comfortable into capable, who trusted her with program that shouldn't have worked but did because he believed it could. Finally, they called Thornton forward. He walked slowly, aware of every eye, aware that what he said next would matter, would be remembered, would become part of Price's legacy in ways that ceremony couldn't capture. He stood at the podium looking out over assembled faces, young and old, military and civilian, the span of a career's influence. General Michael Price saved my life twice. First time was Hugh City, 1968. I was 19, pinned in a building, out of ammunition, out of options. He came anyway, pulled me out through streets that were killing grounds, risked his life for a private he barely knew. That's who he was, someone who came back for people. Thornton paused. Let the words settle. Let people understand this wasn't eulogy, it was testimony. Second time he saved my life was 5 years ago. Called me back to service when I'd given up on having anything left to give. Asked me to teach, to share, to turn survival guilt into purpose. I didn't want to do it, but he called in a debt, said I owed him, and he was right. What he didn't say was that he was saving me from myself, from 52 years of carrying ghosts without purpose, from surviving without living. He gave me a reason to stand watch again. Not for glory, not for redemption, just for service. That's what he did for thousands of soldiers across his career. Made service mean something beyond just following orders. The program we built together, the reconciliation training, the former enemies teaching alongside us, that was Mike's vision, Mike's courage, Mike's understanding that the next war we prevent is worth more than the last war we win. He fought hard his entire life, but his greatest battle was teaching others how not to fight unnecessarily. Thornton looked at the flag-draped casket, American flag, 50 stars, 13 stripes, symbol of everything Price had served, everything he'd defended, everything he'd died having given 42 years to protect. General Price once told me that soldiers don't choose when to stop serving. They serve until they're released. Mike, you're released. Stand down. We got the watch from here. Rest easy knowing your legacy isn't just the soldiers you trained. It's the wars they prevented, the enemies they understood, the cycles they broke. That's immortality. That's honor. That's what you gave us. He stepped back, saluted, held it until his arm trembled, then lowered slowly, walking back to his seat through silence that felt like respect and grief compressed into physical weight. After the service, Price's widow found him. Eleanor, 70 years old, still beautiful in the way that came from being loved well and long. She held an envelope with Thornton's name written in handwriting he recognized. Price's script, precise, controlled, military even in personal correspondence. He wrote this 6 months ago, said to give it to you after, made me promise. Thornton took it carefully, feeling weight disproportionate to paper and ink. Did he know? That he was dying? No. But he knew he was old, knew time was finite, wanted to say things while he could, before the opportunity passed. She touched his arm gently. Jim, he considered you a brother, closer than blood. Wanted you to know that whatever you carried it with honor. He was proud of who you became. After she left, Thornton found a quiet spot under an oak tree at the cemetery's edge. Opened the envelope with fingers that shook slightly. Inside, 2 pages. Price's handwriting filling them with words written in solitude, planning for absence. Jim, if you're reading this, I'm gone, hopefully quick. Hopefully without prolonged suffering. But gone regardless. And there are things I need to say while my voice still exists, even if only in ink. First, Hugh City. You've thanked me 100 times for pulling you out, but you never asked why I came back for you. The truth is I saw something. In your eyes, in your rage, in the way you fought like someone who'd given up on surviving. I saw someone who needed saving not from the enemy, but from himself. And I thought maybe if I saved your body, you'd eventually save your soul. Took 51 years. But you did. I'm proud of that. Second, the program, the reconciliation training. You think that was my idea, my vision. But Jim, that was yours. You just didn't recognize it. Everything you taught came from understanding that enemy was human. That war created victims on both sides. That the cost of combat was paid by people who rarely chose to fight. I just gave you platform. You provided the wisdom. Third, what comes next? I'm making you a promise and asking one in return. My promise is this, the program continues. Sarah has my full endorsement. Pentagon backing, resources to expand. Your work won't die with me. It becomes institutional, permanent, legacy. My request is simple. Keep teaching, keep sharing, keep making sure the next generation understands war's cost before they pay it. You're 72 now, probably feeling old, probably thinking about stopping. Don't, not yet. Not while soldiers still need what you know. Finally, Tommy, you've carried him for 52 years, carried all 11 of them. But Jim, they're not yours to carry anymore. They're memories, teachers, guides, but not burdens. You honored them by learning, by teaching, by making their deaths mean something beyond just tragedy. Release them, let them rest. They've taught you everything they can. Now you teach others. That's how honor works. That's how ghosts become legacy. Thank you for being my friend. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for teaching. And thank you for showing me that old warriors can still serve. Just differently, just wiser, just better. Stand watch, brother, until we meet again, Mike. Thornton read it twice, then folded it carefully, placed it in his jacket pocket over his heart, sat under the oak tree while cemetery emptied and afternoon shadows lengthened. Processing release he'd never asked for, but apparently needed. Permission to let go given by someone whose opinion mattered. That evening, there was a gathering. Price's house, family, and close friends. Thornton almost didn't go. Social situations felt harder now. Small talk seemed trivial. But Sarah convinced him, said people wanted to thank him, wanted to hear stories, wanted to connect with the man Price had written about in journals and letters. The house was full, laughter mixing with tears the way it did when good people died, having lived fully. Thornton found himself in the corner, drink in hand that he wasn't drinking, watching people celebrate a life while mourning its end. Chen found him there, captain no longer, lieutenant colonel now, running training operations at Fort Benning that had grown to encompass the reconciliation program in standard infantry preparation. They'd worked together on and off for 5 years, developed respect that transcended initial friction. Colonel, good to see you. Wish it was under better circumstances. Chen, you're looking well. Command suits you. It's terrifying, but a Price taught me something important. That leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking better questions. You taught me the rest. That soldiers are humans first. That training them to survive is meaningless if we don't train them to live after. You learned that on your own, I just pointed. No, sir. You lived it. That's different. That's why when soldiers ask me how to carry failure, I tell them your story, about Tommy, about 52 years, about how burden becomes purpose if you choose to make it so. Other officers approached, shared stories, thanked him for training that had saved lives, for perspective that had prevented conflicts, for wisdom that had made them better commanders. Thornton accepted gratitude with discomfort that came from never quite believing he'd earned it. Then Ahmed al-Rashid appeared, 63 now, frailer than 5 years ago, but eyes still sharp, still carrying Omar's memory with grace that inspired more than crushed. Colonel Thornton, I wanted to thank you. For what? For my son. Kareem graduated Ranger School last month, top of his class, received assignment to 75th Regiment. He called me crying, happy, tears, said he finally understood how to honor Omar by protecting others so they don't die unnecessarily. That's what you taught him. That's what his brother taught him. I just translated. No, you showed him path. Between hate and forgiveness, there is service. Between guilt and peace, there is purpose. Kareem walks that path because you walked it first. That is legacy, my friend. As the evening wound down, Sarah pulled Thornton aside. They stepped onto back porch where night air carried chill that felt cleaner than crowded house warmth. She handed him a folder. Official documents, Army letterhead. What's this? Promotion recommendation from Price, written 3 months before he died. He wanted you to return to active duty as special advisor. Full bird colonel, assigned to training and doctrine command, overseeing reconciliation program, expansion to all branches. Navy, Marines, Air Force. I'm 72, I'm retired. Age waiver is approved. Pentagon wants this. Joint Chiefs want this. You're the only person with credibility to make this work across services. Price knew that. Spent his last months building political support. All that's missing is your signature. Thornton stared at the documents. Return to active duty. Return to uniform that felt increasingly like costume. Return to military structure that had defined and confined him for so many decades. Everything in him wanted to refuse. Wanted to go back to Tennessee. To porch mornings. To quiet hills where ghosts whispered instead of demanded. But Price's letter sat over his heart. Keep teaching. Keep sharing. Not yet. Not while soldiers still need what you know. When would this start? January. 3 months. Gives you time to prepare, to understand what you're agreeing to. And if I say no, then program continues under my leadership. We make do, but we lose something. We lose the voice of someone who lived this, who carries the weight authentically, who can speak to generals and privates with equal credibility. We lose you, and that's loss the program can't afford yet. Thornton looked up at stars emerging through suburban light pollution. Thought about Tommy, about Price, about 52 years of carrying and 5 years of teaching, about whether there was difference between being released and being needed, whether rest was something you earned or something you took before the work was finished. Let me think about it. I'll give you an answer in a week. The drive back to Tennessee felt longer than 11 hours, like traveling through years instead of miles. Each rest stop, each gas station, each anonymous town on highways that connected everywhere to nowhere. Thornton drove and thought and drove. turning the question over until edges wore smooth. Home appeared like relief and prison simultaneously. Familiar, safe, limiting. He parked in the driveway that needed paving, walked to the house that needed paint, sat on the porch that needed replacing. Everything needed something, including him, apparently. That night he dreamed. Not nightmares, not Tommy calling his name. Different dreams, futures, possibilities. Soldiers learning from old warriors who taught not just tactics but wisdom. Programs expanding until every service member understood that enemy was human. That war was last resort. That the bravest act was choosing peace when violence would be easier. He dreamed about Omar and Kareem, about sons who died and sons who lived to honor dead brothers, about fathers who killed and fathers who forgave, about cycles breaking because someone chose understanding over hate. He dreamed about Delacroix somewhere in Canada, building life beyond military service, finding peace that had eluded him in uniform, visiting Tugh's grave because the old man had died 2 years ago, cancer taking what war couldn't, father and son finally at peace with histories that had defined them. He dreamed about Sarah leading the program, about Chen expanding it, about Price watching from wherever dead generals went, satisfied that work continued, that vision lived, that legacy mattered. And he dreamed about himself. 72, old, tired, but not finished. Not yet. Not while the work needed doing, not while soldiers needed teaching, not while Tommy's forgiveness still carried lessons worth sharing. Morning came with decision already made. Thornton knew before consciousness fully returned. Knew in the way you knew important things. In bones, in marrow, in places deeper than thought. He called Sarah at 0700. She answered immediately, waiting, hoping. I'll do it. 3 years, that's my commitment. 3 years active duty, then I'm done, finished, released. 3 years is enough, maybe more than enough. Thank you, Colonel. Don't thank me yet. I'm going to push harder than anyone's comfortable with. I'm going to tell truths that make commanders nervous. I'm going to bring former enemies into training over objections and regulations and protocols that say it's impossible. Good, that's exactly what we need, what they need. January arrived cold and gray. Thornton reported to Training and Doctrine Command headquarters at Fort Eustis, Virginia. Received credentials, office, staff, authority to reshape how American military prepared people for war by teaching them to understand it first. The work was overwhelming. Multiple services, different cultures, competing priorities. Resistance from officers who thought reconciliation was weakness. From enlisted soldiers who thought understanding enemy was betrayal. From politicians who thought teaching soldiers enemy's perspective was dangerous liberalism. But Thornton had earned capital. 52 years carrying failure. 5 years teaching success. Credibility built from scars visible and invisible. He spent that capital ruthlessly. Pushed programs, demanded changes, brought former adversaries into training over objections that died when results proved effectiveness. By year 1, program was standard at 20 installations. By year 2, mandatory for all officers attending career courses. By year 3, integrated into basic training. Every American service member now received exposure to reconciliation concepts, to understanding that enemy was human, that war cost everyone, that preventing conflict was victory larger than winning it. Thornton taught constantly. Classes, seminars, presentations, sharing Tommy's story until it felt polished, rehearsed, but still true, still cutting, still teaching that survival guilt could become purpose if you chose to make it so. He brought in more veterans, American and foreign, soldiers who'd fought each other in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Balkans, letting them teach together, share perspectives, show young soldiers that the person who tried to kill you yesterday might be person you needed to understand today. Sarah managed operations. Chen handled logistics. Ahmed consulted on cultural sensitivity. Kareem, now Sergeant al-Rashid, taught classes on how to honor dead siblings by protecting living soldiers. The program became ecosystem, self-sustaining, growing. 3 years passed faster than Thornton expected. Training soldiers, building programs, watching the military slowly shift from seeing enemies as abstractions to seeing them as humans who made choices in impossible circumstances. Not softening, sharpening, fighting smarter by understanding better. On his 75th birthday, Thornton received notice. His commitment was complete. Time to retire. Again. Finally. For real this time. The retirement ceremony was small. His choice. Sarah, Chen, Ahmed, Kareem, handful of generals who'd supported the program. Eleanor Price attending for Mike, who'd believed this was possible before anyone else did. Sarah pinned final medal on his chest, not for combat, not for valor, for service, for teaching, for transforming personal failure into institutional wisdom. The citation read like Price had written it, probably had before he died, making sure Thornton received recognition that mattered even if he didn't think he'd earned it. Colonel James Thornton, for exceptional service in transforming military training to incorporate reconciliation, understanding, and cultural wisdom. For teaching generations of soldiers that understanding enemy makes victory more likely and necessary conflict less frequent. For demonstrating that carrying failure with purpose creates legacy more valuable than success without growth. The United States military is forever changed by your service. Applause, brief, respectful, then silence that felt appropriate. Thornton stood at attention, receiving words that felt simultaneously too much and not enough. Everything he'd done came from failure, from hiding, from letting better men die. How did that become honor? How did survival become service? But he understood now, finally, after 57 years, that Tommy's forgiveness hadn't been about absolving guilt. It had been about releasing potential, about giving permission to live fully instead of half dying while breathing, about understanding that the lesson wasn't survival, it was what you did with surviving. After the ceremony, they gathered at Sarah's house. Informal, pizza and beer and conversation that moved between serious and silly without friction. Thornton sat in a corner with Ahmed, two old men who'd fought different wars but learned same lessons. What will you do now? Ahmed asked. Go home, train bird dogs, watch the hills. Maybe write something about all this before I forget how to form sentences. You should write. These stories need preserving, need sharing beyond military, so civilians understand war's true cost. Maybe, if the words come. Kareem approached, 29 now, sergeant with Ranger tab and combat patch, carrying himself with confidence that came from competence tested in fire. He looked like his father, but moved like his brother's memory, the fusion creating something new. Colonel, thank you for everything. I wouldn't be here without you. You'd be here, just angrier. I just helped you channel it. No, sir. You taught me something more important than tactics or training. You taught me that the dead speak loudest when we live to honor them. That Omar's death doesn't just diminish the world. It teaches the world if I choose to carry his lesson instead of his anger. That's what you do with Tommy. What Sarah does with her father. What Master Sergeant Delacroix did with his father's past. We carry them forward, not as burdens, as guides. After everyone left, Sarah drove Thornton to the airport. His flight back to Tennessee departed at 1800. Time enough for final conversation, final transfer of responsibility, final release. The program is yours now, Thornton said, completely. No advisor role, no checking in. You lead it where it needs to go. That's terrifying. Good leaders are always terrified. Keeps you honest, keeps you checking assumptions, keeps you remembering that decisions affect humans, not just statistics. How do I know if I'm making right choices? You don't. Not in the moment. You make best choice available with information you have. Then you live with consequences. Then you learn. Then you choose better next time. That's not leadership. That's just being human while responsible for others. They sat in comfortable silence, airport traffic flowing around them, people coming and going, lives intersecting, briefly then separating. The rhythm of modern existence. Colonel, do you think Tommy would be proud of what you built, of who you became? Thornton thought about 19-year-old kid from Iowa who died asking for help that didn't come. About 57 years of carrying that moment. About 5 years of teaching what that moment taught. About transformation from survival to service. I think Tommy already gave me everything he had. His forgiveness, his understanding, his belief that I could become more than the coward who hid. Whether he be proud doesn't matter. What matters is I finally used what he gave me, finally made his death teach instead of just hurt. That's what he wanted. That's what I delivered. Late, but delivered. That's beautiful, sir. That's just true. Beauty and truth aren't always the same, but sometimes they overlap. The flight home was smooth. Thornton dozed, woke, dozed again, dreaming fragments that dissolved on waking, Tommy smiling, Price saluting, Delacroix disappearing into trees, Ahmed forgiving, Sarah leading, Kareem serving, all of it flowing together into narrative that made sense only in retrospect, only when viewed as whole instead of isolated moments. Tennessee appeared through clouds, hills and valleys, rivers and forests, home in the way that mattered, not where you were born, but where you chose to stay when staying became optional. The house was exactly as he'd left it, unchanged, patient, waiting. He unpacked efficiently. Muscle memory from 50 years of temporary quarters. Hung uniforms in closet. Placed medals in shadow box. Set photograph of 11 dead men on kitchen table where it had always lived. But this time he added something new. Photo from retirement ceremony. Sarah and Chen, Ahmed and Kareem, the program staff. Everyone who'd taken what he'd started and made it permanent, made it matter, made it legacy. Tommy's face looked at him from 1972. Thornton's face looked back from the present. 57 years between images. Lifetime of carrying and learning, of failing and teaching, of surviving and serving. I did it, brother. Took me too long. But I made your death matter. Made all their deaths matter. Taught soldiers that understanding is strength, that carrying failure with purpose creates future better than ignoring it, that forgiveness is gift that keeps teaching long after the giver dies. Thank you for giving me that gift. Thank you for releasing me to use it. Thank you for being patient while I figured out what you tried to teach from the start. The photograph didn't answer, never did. But somehow an afternoon light filtering through Tennessee windows, Tommy's smile looked less like accusation and more like approval. Less like calling for help that didn't come and more like celebrating help that eventually did. Just differently. Just wiser. Just better. That evening, Thornton sat on his porch watching sunset paint the sky. 75 years old, retired, released, ready finally for rest that felt earned instead of stolen. But part of him stayed standing watch, would always stand watch, because that's what soldiers did. Not for glory, not for recognition, just for service, just for understanding that someone needed to remain vigilant so others could sleep soundly. The hills held their secrets. The stars emerged. And James Thornton, colonel retired, survivor of wars that wouldn't end and student of lessons that took lifetimes to learn, sat in the gathering darkness feeling something he'd sought for 57 years. Not peace. Peace was too absolute, too finished. But something close. Acceptance maybe. Understanding. The knowledge that survival without purpose was wasted life. That guilt without action was just suffering. That carrying the dead honorably meant making their deaths teach the living. And in that knowledge, in that hard-won understanding, James Thornton finally set down the burden he'd carried since Tommy Bridger died calling his name. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but transforming. From weight that crushed to legacy that elevated. From failure that defined to wisdom that taught. The Sentinel had stood his watch. 57 years, long enough. Others had the watch now. Sarah and Chen, Ahmed and Kareem, the thousands of soldiers who'd learned that understanding enemy was first step to defeating them, or better yet, avoiding conflict entirely. The old warrior could rest, could watch the hills, could train his bird dogs, could write his stories if words came, could live whatever years remained not as penance but as reward, not as survivor but as teacher who'd finally learned his own lesson. And if nightmares came, if Tommy called, if the ghost stirred, he'd remind them gently that they'd already taught him everything, that their work was finished, that they could rest because he'd made sure their deaths mattered, made sure their sacrifice taught, made sure the next generation learned from mistakes instead of repeating them. That was honor, that was service, that was legacy. And finally, after 57 years of carrying, it was enough. The darkness deepened, the stars multiplied, and James Thornton sat in peace that came not from forgetting, but from remembering well, from caring honorably, from transforming burden into purpose and purpose into legacy that would outlive him. The Sentinel's watch was complete. The lesson had been taught. The ghost could rest, and so could he.